Deep in the Vatican's most restricted archive sits a file marked only with 6 wings and a single word: Silentium. Inside are accounts that challenge everything we think we know about angels. Because while the Church taught us to fear the devil, they spent centuries hiding something far more dangerous to their authority: the true nature of the Seraphim, the burning ones who stand closest to God's throne. Tonight, we uncover why these highest angels became the Vatican's most guarded secret. The autumn of 847 AD was unusually cold in Ravenna. Fog rolled in from the Adriatic, shrouding the ancient Byzantine streets in mist that seemed to muffle even the cathedral bells. But the silence that descended over the city that October had nothing to do with weather. It was deliberate, careful, and enforced by men who understood that some conversations were too dangerous for history to remember. They came from across the Christian world, these bishops and abbots traveling under cover stories and false names. No papal summons had been issued. No official documents announced their gathering. To outside observers, they were simply prelates on private pilgrimages, drawn to Ravenna's sacred mosaics and relics. But behind the walls of the Archbishop's palace, 37 of the Church's most trusted leaders convened for a meeting that would never appear in any chronicle, any archive, any official record of Church business. They called it the Council of Silence, and they had come to discuss a problem that threatened the very foundation of Christian authority. The Seraphim were speaking directly to the faithful. The evidence had been mounting for decades. From monasteries in Ireland to desert hermitages in Syria, reports filtered back to Rome of mystics claiming encounters with 6-winged beings of impossible light. These weren't the gentle guardian angels of popular devotion or the warrior messengers of biblical tradition. These were the Seraphim, the burning ones, who stood at the very throne of God, crying, "Holy, holy, holy," in voices that could shatter mountains. And they were delivering messages that bypassed every priest, every bishop, every carefully constructed hierarchy the Church had built. Brother Malachy of Armagh had been the first to cause alarm. In 834 AD, this simple Irish monk claimed a seraphim had appeared to him during midnight prayers, wings spanning the entire width of his cell, face blazing with light too bright to comprehend. The angel spoke no words, Malachy reported, but somehow filled his mind with complete knowledge of divine truths, understandings that rendered years of theological study meaningless in an instant. When questioned by his abbot, Malachy couldn't explain how he suddenly knew things no human teacher had ever told him. He spoke of the true nature of the Trinity with startling clarity, described the architecture of heaven in precise detail, and most troubling of all, answered complex theological questions that had puzzled church doctors for centuries. His responses weren't heretical, but they were independent. They came from a source beyond the Church's control. Similar reports emerged from a convent near Tours, where Sister Bernadette claimed a burning angel had shown her visions of humanity's true relationship with the divine. She began teaching other nuns that they could commune directly with God, without need for sacraments, that their souls carried sparks of divine fire that could be kindled through proper prayer. When the local bishop investigated, he found her teachings technically orthodox, but practically revolutionary. If true, they suggested the entire clerical system was unnecessary. Then came the case that finally forced the Church's hand. In 843 AD, a simple peasant named Giorgio from a village outside Rome claimed a seraphim had appeared to him while he worked his fields. The angel, he said, had burned away his illiteracy with a touch, instantly granting him the ability to read any text in any language. When skeptical priests tested him, Giorgio flawlessly recited passages from Greek theological works he'd never seen, translated Hebrew psalms he'd never heard, and answered complex questions about Scripture with the insight of a seasoned theologian. But Giorgio went further. He began preaching in his village that God spoke directly to human hearts, that the divine light dwelt within every person, waiting to be awakened. His words carried such power, such inexplicable authority, that crowds gathered from neighboring towns. Some claimed to experience their own visions in his presence. Others reported spontaneous healing, sudden spiritual insights, profound mystical experiences that required no church, no priest, no mediating institution whatsoever. Within months, similar movements erupted across southern Italy. Peasants claimed angelic visitations. Simple farmers spoke with the authority of bishops. Uneducated women preached with theological sophistication that stunned learned clerics. All claimed direct contact with Seraphim, who revealed divine truths without reference to church teaching or papal authority. The crisis was existential. If ordinary people could receive divine revelation directly from God's highest angels, what purpose did the church serve? If Seraphim could instantly transmit complete theological understanding, why were years of seminary training necessary? If the burning ones could awaken the divine spark in any human soul, what distinguished priests from peasants? Archbishop Hurribanus of Mainz captured the terror in a letter that survived only because it was buried in the foundation stones of a monastery wall during renovations in 1134 AD. The very angels of God have become our adversaries, not through corruption but through their purity. They offer what we have claimed only we can provide: direct access to the divine throne. If this continues, the faithful will have no need of us at all. The Council of Ravenna met in absolute secrecy for 12 days. No stenographers recorded their debates. No scribes documented their decisions. But fragments of their deliberations survived in personal letters, hidden diaries, and coded references that took historians centuries to piece together. The bishops faced an impossible theological problem. They couldn't denounce the seraphim as demons without contradicting Scripture. They couldn't question the angel's authority without questioning God's own nature. But they also couldn't allow these encounters to continue undermining the Church's role as humanity's necessary intermediary with the divine. Their solution was brilliantly subtle. Rather than attacking the angels themselves, they would reframe human capacity to receive such revelations. The council secretly decreed that while seraphim encounters might be genuine, the fallen human nature was incapable of properly understanding such pure divine communication. Without proper theological training and ecclesiastical guidance, even authentic angelic messages could be misinterpreted, leading souls into error. This allowed the Church to acknowledge seraphic visions while asserting clerical authority over their meaning. Mystics who claimed direct revelation would be examined by trained theologians who would determine the correct interpretation of their experiences. Any understanding that contradicted established doctrine would be deemed a misapprehension of the divine message, evidence of human limitation rather than angelic error. The Council also established the first protocols for investigating claimed angelic encounters. These procedures, refined over centuries, would eventually become the basis for all Vatican investigations of supernatural phenomena. But unlike later protocols for examining miraculous claims, these early procedures were designed not to verify authenticity, but to contain theological implications. Most crucially, the Council of Ravenna established the principle that would guide church policy for the next millennium. Divine revelation might continue through angelic visitations, but its proper interpretation required institutional authority. Individual mystical experiences, no matter how profound, could never supersede collective church wisdom. In the days following the council, the participating bishops returned to their dioceses with new instructions. Reports of seraphim encounters weren't to be suppressed entirely. Such obvious denial might breed suspicion. Instead, they were to be carefully managed, their implications redirected, their revolutionary potential neutralized through theological interpretation. Brother Malachi was quietly transferred to a remote monastery, where his theological insights could be properly guided. Sister Bernadette was assigned a series of learned confessors who helped her understand the correct meaning of her visions. Giorgio, the peasant, simply disappeared from historical record, though local legends in his village speak of a man who walked into the hills one evening and was never seen again. But the Council's most lasting legacy wasn't its specific decisions about individual cases. It was the precedent it established. When faced with genuine spiritual phenomena that threatened institutional authority, the Church would neither deny nor embrace, but control. They would become the gatekeepers of heaven itself, the interpreters of divine will, the necessary mediators between human seekers and even God's highest angels. This pattern would repeat for centuries. Mystics would report transformative encounters with beings of light. Church investigators would acknowledge the reality of their experiences while asserting exclusive authority to interpret their meaning. The Seraphim would continue to appear, but their messages would be filtered through ecclesiastical understanding, their revolutionary implications carefully contained within orthodox boundaries. The Council of Ravenna had faced the ultimate challenge to religious authority. What happens when God's own messengers bypass human institutions? Their answer became the template for managing divine revelation in the Christian world. Not suppression, but interpretation. Not denial, but control. And in the fog-shrouded streets of Ravenna, as the bishops departed for their distant dioceses, the silence that had covered their meeting settled over the Church's relationship with its greatest spiritual challenge. A silence that would endure for more than 1,000 years, broken only by whispered rumors and carefully hidden documents that hinted at the true scope of the Seraphim problem. The burning ones had not been defeated. They had simply been contained, their fire banked but not extinguished, their messages translated into safer forms. But fire has a way of spreading, and divine light, once kindled, proves remarkably difficult to snuff out entirely. In monastery scriptoriums and convent cells, in hermit caves and pilgrim paths, the encounters would continue. And with each visitation, each moment of direct divine contact, the question raised at Ravenna would grow more pressing. If humanity could commune directly with God's highest angels, what purpose did human religious authority serve? It was a question the Church would spend the next millennium trying to answer, one carefully managed mystical experience at a time. But the Seraphim, beings of pure divine will, unconstrained by human politics, would prove less amenable to institutional control than the bishops of Ravenna had hoped. Their fire burned too bright, their message too clear, their presence too transformative, to be contained indefinitely within the careful boundaries of orthodox interpretation. The Council of Silence had bought the Church time. But time, like divine revelation, has a way of revealing truths that no amount of careful management can indefinitely suppress. The scroll was supposed to have been destroyed in 391 AD, when Theophilus of Alexandria ordered the burning of the great library. But someone, perhaps a Christian scribe who understood what was at stake, perhaps a Jewish scholar who recognized the text's true importance, had hidden it away. For over 16 centuries, it lay sealed in a lead casket beneath the ruins of an ancient monastery near Mount Sinai, until Bedouin treasure hunters accidentally uncovered it in 1947. What they found was a complete Greek translation of Ezekiel's vision, but not the sanitized version that made its way into the biblical canon. This was the original account, unedited by nervous church fathers, unfiltered by theological committees, desperate to maintain institutional control. And what it described would have terrified the bishops, who spent centuries carefully rewriting the prophet's words. In the canonical book of Ezekiel, chapter 1 describes strange creatures with 4 faces and wheels within wheels, images so bizarre that Jewish tradition warns against studying them too deeply. The Talmud forbids anyone under 30 from reading Ezekiel's vision, claiming it contains mysteries too dangerous for unprepared minds. Early Christian commentators echoed this caution, treating the text as symbolic poetry rather than literal description. But the hidden scroll told a different story entirely. According to this earlier version, what Ezekiel encountered by the river Chebar wasn't a collection of mystical creatures, but beings of pure consciousness entities that existed as living thought, divine intelligence made manifest. The prophet's original Hebrew described them not as having physical forms at all, but as patterns of awareness that could take any shape necessary to communicate with human perception. The four faces mentioned in the canonical text weren't literal features, but representations of how divine consciousness appeared when filtered through human understanding. The lion face represented raw divine power. The ox showed divine service. The eagle revealed divine transcendence. And the human face reflected divine intimacy, the shocking possibility that divine consciousness was not separate from human consciousness, but was, in fact, its ultimate source and destination. Most revelatory were the passages describing what happened when these beings identified in the hidden text explicitly as seraphim made direct contact with human awareness. Ezekiel wrote of consciousness suddenly expanding beyond the boundaries of individual identity, of receiving complete understanding of divine truths in instantaneous downloads of pure knowledge. He described experiencing what he called the opening of the inner eye, a permanent transformation that granted access to divine wisdom without need for priests, temples, or religious intermediaries. The hidden scroll contained detailed instructions for achieving this state of consciousness. Ezekiel provided specific meditation techniques, breathing practices, and mental preparations that could facilitate direct contact with seraphic intelligence. He wrote of successful encounters with other individuals who had undergone similar transformations, describing a network of humans who had achieved permanent communion with divine consciousness. This was mystical dynamite. If authentic, Ezekiel's original vision suggested that direct divine contact wasn't a rare prophetic gift, but a latent human capacity that could be systematically developed. The seraphim weren't distant heavenly beings occasionally visiting chosen prophets. They were accessible to anyone who understood the proper methods for expanding consciousness beyond normal limitations. When early church fathers first encountered these texts in the late 2nd century, they recognized the existential threat immediately. Saint Jerome, translating scripture into Latin in the 4th century, wrote privately to Bishop Damasus about his concerns with certain passages in Ezekiel. In a letter discovered in 1623, but immediately classified by Vatican archivists, Jerome confessed that the prophet's original descriptions seemed to suggest dangerous innovations in the relationship between the divine and human spheres. Jerome wasn't alone in his concerns. Church Father John Chrysostom, known as the Golden-Mouthed for his eloquent preaching, nevertheless wrote privately about his struggles with Ezekiel's vision. In marginal notes found in his personal copy of Scripture, a manuscript that spent centuries in a locked chest in Constantinople, Chrysostom questioned whether the prophet's encounter represented direct divine instruction, bypassing all earthly authority. The problem wasn't that church fathers doubted the authenticity of Ezekiel's experience. On the contrary, they believed it completely. That was what terrified them. If a Hebrew prophet living in Babylonian exile could achieve direct communion with God's highest angels, what prevented ordinary Christians from pursuing similar contact? If divine consciousness was accessible through specific practices rather than exclusive revelation, what distinguished clergy from laity? St. Augustine addressed this crisis directly in his private correspondence with other bishops. In letters that remained sealed in the Vatican's secret archives until a cataloging error briefly made them accessible to researchers in 1978, Augustine outlined a theological strategy that would guide church policy for centuries, distinguish between prophetic revelation and mystical experience. Augustine argued that while Ezekiel's vision was genuine divine revelation intended for all believers, attempts by ordinary Christians to replicate his mystical experiences represented dangerous spiritual presumption. Prophets, he claimed, received divine visions for the benefit of the entire community and were specifically chosen by God for this purpose. Individual mystics, who sought similar experiences, were motivated by spiritual pride rather than divine calling. This distinction allowed the Church to honor Ezekiel's authority, while discouraging Christians from pursuing their own direct encounters with divine consciousness. But it required careful editing of the prophet's original account to remove the practical instructions and detailed descriptions of how such encounters could be achieved. The canonical version of Ezekiel that emerged from this editing process transformed a mystical manual into symbolic poetry. Specific meditation techniques became metaphorical imagery. Detailed descriptions of consciousness expansion were reduced to colorful but incomprehensible visions. Most crucially, Ezekiel's explicit identification of his divine contacts as seraphim beings who could grant direct access to divine knowledge was obscured through translation choices that emphasized their otherworldly strangeness rather than their accessibility. Church Father Origen, whose biblical commentaries influenced Christian interpretation for centuries, explicitly addressed the need for this editorial approach. In a theological treatise that survived only in fragments hidden in Syrian monasteries, Origen wrote that Ezekiel's vision contained truths too pure for unguided consumption. He argued that while the prophet's encounter was authentic, its full meaning could only be safely interpreted by those with proper theological training. This interpretive framework became the template for managing all subsequent reports of direct angelic contact. Individual mystics might experience genuine divine encounters, but their proper meaning required ecclesiastical interpretation. Personal revelation, no matter how profound, could never supersede institutional authority over spiritual truth. The early church's handling of Ezekiel established a crucial precedent. When faced with scriptural evidence of direct divine human contact that bypassed religious hierarchy, the solution wasn't to deny the text's authenticity, but to control its interpretation. This approach allowed church authorities to acknowledge the reality of divine revelation while asserting exclusive authority over its meaning and application. Bishop Ephraim the Syrian, writing in the 4th century, captured this strategy perfectly in a letter to fellow theologians. The prophet saw truly, but seeing and understanding are distinct gifts. What Ezekiel witnessed was intended for the instruction of the faithful, not for their imitation. But controlling interpretation proved more difficult than early church fathers anticipated. Throughout the patristic period, Christian mystics continued to reference Ezekiel's vision as validation for their own experiences of direct divine contact. Desert fathers and mothers reported encounters with beings of light that matched the prophet's descriptions. Hermits claimed to achieve the same expanded states of consciousness Ezekiel described. Saint Anthony of Egypt, father of Christian monasticism, explicitly connected his mystical experiences to Ezekiel's vision in letters that survived only because they were preserved by his most trusted disciples. Anthony described encountering beings of pure flame whose presence opened regions of understanding previously hidden from human awareness. He wrote of receiving direct instruction from entities he identified as Seraphim, claiming they provided knowledge of divine truths that no human teacher had ever shared. These accounts created ongoing challenges for church authorities. They couldn't denounce revered mystics like Anthony without undermining monasticism itself, but they also couldn't allow his claims to legitimize pursuit of direct angelic contact among ordinary Christians. The solution was to reframe Anthony's experiences as exceptional divine gifts granted to uniquely holy individuals rather than evidence of generally accessible spiritual practices. This strategy required ongoing vigilance. Each generation of Christian mystics produced individuals who connected their experiences to Ezekiel's vision, requiring careful theological management to prevent their accounts from inspiring broader movements toward direct divine contact. The Church developed sophisticated techniques for acknowledging mystical experiences while containing their implications. St. John of the Cross, the great 16th century mystic, faced exactly this challenge when his writings about divine union attracted too much attention. Church authorities didn't question his spiritual authenticity, but insisted that his experiences represented extraordinary divine favor rather than achievable spiritual goals. His detailed descriptions of mystical states were reframed as poetic metaphors rather than practical guidance. The pattern established in the early church's handling of Ezekiel continued for centuries. Genuine mystical experiences would be acknowledged, but carefully interpreted to preserve institutional authority over spiritual development. Individual encounters with divine consciousness, no matter how transformative, could never supersede collective church wisdom about proper spiritual practice. But the hidden scroll discovered near Mount Sinai suggested that this entire framework was built on a fundamental misrepresentation of Ezekiel's original vision. If the prophet's authentic account described systematic methods for achieving direct divine contact, then centuries of church teaching about the exclusive nature of such experiences was not protective theology, but deliberate obstruction of human spiritual potential. The implications were staggering. If Ezekiel's original vision was accurate, then the Seraphim were not distant heavenly beings occasionally visiting chosen prophets, but accessible manifestations of divine consciousness, available to anyone who understood proper spiritual practices. If his detailed instructions for consciousness expansion were authentic, then direct divine knowledge was not an exclusive prophetic gift, but a latent human capacity that institutional religion had systematically suppressed. The scholar who first translated the hidden scroll, a Coptic priest working in the basement of the Cairo Museum, reportedly experienced a nervous breakdown after completing his work. Colleagues found him in his study, surrounded by burned papers, muttering repeatedly about the theft of divine inheritance. He was quietly committed to a monastery, where he spent his remaining years in contemplative silence, never again speaking about his discoveries. The scroll itself disappeared shortly after its translation, removed from the museum's collection without explanation. Official records show only that it was transferred to appropriate authorities for further study, but no subsequent research was ever published. Museum staff who asked about its whereabouts were told that their security clearance was insufficient for information about certain artifacts. But copies of the translation had already been made, and despite official efforts to suppress them, fragments began circulating in underground scholarly networks. Theologians, historians, and mystics who encountered these fragments reported similar experiences of profound spiritual disorientation. The text seemed to awaken something, to trigger recognition of possibilities that institutional religion had spent centuries convincing believers were impossible. Today, only scattered excerpts of the translation survive in private collections and encrypted digital files shared among researchers willing to risk their careers to preserve this knowledge. Each excerpt confirms the same revolutionary claim. Ezekiel's original vision described not a unique prophetic experience, but a reproducible method for direct communion with divine consciousness. If authentic, this hidden account of Ezekiel's vision explains why the early church fathers were so determined to rewrite the prophet's words. They weren't protecting believers from dangerous spiritual practices. They were protecting institutional authority from obsolescence. Because if every human being carried the capacity for direct divine contact, what purpose did religious hierarchies serve? The burning ones Ezekiel encountered were not distant celestial beings requiring priestly mediation to reach human awareness. They were manifestations of divine consciousness, seeking direct communion with human consciousness, offering knowledge and transformation that bypassed every institutional barrier the church would spend centuries constructing. And perhaps most threatening of all, they were still accessible, still offering the same direct contact, still waiting for humans ready to reclaim their hidden spiritual inheritance. The smoke rose for 7 days. From the harbor of Alexandria, sailors could see the black columns ascending from the city's heart, carrying with them the accumulated wisdom of centuries. But Patriarch Theophilus of Alexandria wasn't burning random scrolls or pagan philosophy. He was systematically destroying something far more specific: every text that described direct human contact with the Seraphim. It was March 391 AD, and the Roman Empire had officially embraced Christianity. Emperor Theodosius I had issued edicts closing pagan temples and banning non-Christian worship. To most observers, Theophilus's destruction of the Great Library of Alexandria appeared to be zealous enforcement of imperial policy, the elimination of pagan learning that contradicted Christian truth. But surviving inventories tell a different story. Hidden in the basement of St. Catherine's Monastery, discovered during renovations in 1844, lay charred fragments of Theophilus's personal catalogue of destroyed texts. The list revealed his true targets, not pagan philosophy, but Gnostic Christian writings that described systematic methods for achieving direct divine communion through seraphic contact. The Gnostics had been problematic for Orthodox Christianity since the 2nd century. Unlike mainstream Christians, who emphasized faith, obedience, and sacramental participation, Gnostics claimed direct personal knowledge of divine truth. They taught that every human being carried a spark of divine consciousness that could be awakened through proper spiritual practices. They described elaborate cosmologies populated by divine beings who could be contacted directly, bypassing all religious intermediaries. But among the various Gnostic teachings, those dealing with Seraphim were particularly threatening to Orthodox authorities. While other divine beings in Gnostic systems were often portrayed as distant or abstract, the Seraphim were described as actively seeking contact with human consciousness, offering immediate transformation to anyone prepared to receive their influence. The Gospel of the Burning Ones, a Gnostic text that existed in multiple copies throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, provided detailed accounts of individuals who had achieved permanent contact with seraphic consciousness. Unlike the carefully managed mystical experiences approved by Orthodox authorities, these encounters transformed people into independent spiritual teachers who claimed no need for priestly guidance or ecclesiastical approval. According to fragments preserved in Syrian monasteries, the Gospel described Seraphim as flames of living consciousness that kindle the divine fire within human hearts. It provided specific meditation techniques, breathing practices, and mental preparations for achieving what it called seraphic union, a permanent merger of human and divine awareness that granted complete spiritual autonomy. The text explicitly rejected the need for religious intermediaries. The burning ones speak directly to those who prepare their hearts to receive divine fire. No priest stands between the soul and its divine source. No church contains the boundless light. No authority controls the gift freely given to all who seek with pure intention. This was spiritual anarchism disguised as mystical teaching. If authentic, it suggested that institutional religion was not just unnecessary, but actively obstructive to genuine spiritual development. The Gnostic Seraphim offered direct access to divine knowledge, immediate spiritual transformation, and complete independence from religious authority. Theophilus understood the threat perfectly. In private letters to fellow bishops, discovered in a sealed jar beneath the ruins of the Alexandrian cathedral, he wrote, "The daemon-inspired Gnostics speak not of devils we might exorcise, but of angels who would make every man his own priest, every woman her own theologian. Against such spiritual presumption, all our authority crumbles." The distinction was crucial. Demonic threats actually strengthened church authority by demonstrating humanity's need for spiritual protection. Exorcisms showcased clerical power over evil forces. Warnings about satanic deception encouraged believers to rely on official church teaching rather than personal spiritual experiences. The devil, paradoxically, was the church's ally in maintaining institutional relevance. But Seraphim offered something far more dangerous: direct access to divine truth that made religious institutions obsolete. If humans could commune directly with God's highest angels, receiving immediate spiritual instruction and transformation, what purpose did bishops serve? If seraphic encounters could grant complete spiritual understanding in moments, why were years of theological study necessary? The Gnostic text known as the Thunder Perfect Mind, which survived the Alexandrian burning, only because copies were hidden in Upper Egypt, captured this revolutionary potential. I am the first and the last. I am the honored one and the scorned one. I am the whore and the holy one. I am the wife and the virgin. I am the silence that is incomprehensible, and the idea whose remembrance is frequent. This wasn't poetry, but description of consciousness transformed through seraphic contact. The text described individuals who had achieved such complete spiritual transformation that normal categories of identity no longer applied. They had become living expressions of divine consciousness, simultaneously human and divine, individual and universal. The practical implications terrified Orthodox authorities. Gnostic communities that practiced seraphic communion operated without traditional religious hierarchies. Members who achieved direct divine contact naturally became teachers for others, regardless of gender, education, or social status. Spiritual authority flowed from authentic experience rather than institutional appointment. Church Father Epiphanius of Salamis, writing in his Pannarian Medicine Chest Against Heresies, devoted extensive attention to what he called the Seraphim heresy. Unlike his treatment of other Gnostic teachings, which he dismissed as philosophical errors, his discussion of seraphic practices revealed genuine theological anxiety. They claim, Epiphanius wrote, that the burning ones appear to them in visions more clear than waking sight, granting knowledge that surpasses all learning. They say the fire-winged angels teach them secrets of heaven without need for scripture, tradition, or apostolic succession. In this, they make themselves equal to the prophets, while reducing the church to irrelevance. What particularly alarmed Epiphanius was that Gnostic claims about seraphim encounters couldn't be easily dismissed as delusion or demonic deception. The individuals who reported such experiences often demonstrated remarkable spiritual insight, profound theological understanding, and moral transformation that was difficult to criticize. Their lives bore fruit that even Orthodox critics found admirable. Athanasius of Alexandria, Theophilus's predecessor, had wrestled with this problem in his anti-Gnostic writings. In texts that remained classified in Vatican archives until the 20th century, Athanasius admitted that many Gnostic mystics displayed fruits of genuine spiritual attainment that were difficult to distinguish from authentic divine favor. This created an unprecedented theological crisis. Orthodox Christianity had developed sophisticated criteria for recognizing authentic spiritual experiences: consistency with Scripture, conformity to church teaching, moral transformation, and ecclesiastical approval. But Gnostic seraphic experiences often met all these criteria while simultaneously undermining the institutional framework that established them. The solution required destroying not just the texts, but the entire conceptual framework that made such experiences possible. Theophilus's burning of Alexandria was surgical in its precision. He preserved classical philosophy, mathematical treatises, and even some mystical writings that could be safely reinterpreted within Orthodox boundaries. But any text that provided practical instruction for direct seraphic contact was systematically eliminated. The Coptic manuscript, known as the Dialogue of the Savior, which survived only in fragments hidden in Nag Hammadi, revealed the sophistication of these targeted texts. It contained detailed conversations between divine beings and human students, providing step-by-step guidance for achieving expanded consciousness. The beings identified themselves explicitly as seraphim and offered immediate spiritual transformation to anyone willing to undergo the necessary preparation. The fire-bearers await your calling. One passage read, "Prepare your heart as a dwelling for divine flame. Empty your mind of all learning that separates you from direct knowing. In the silence between thoughts, we speak. In the space between breaths, we kindle the light that burns away all separation." Such instructions posed obvious dangers to institutional authority. If individuals could receive direct spiritual guidance from divine beings, Why were human teachers necessary? If seraphim could immediately kindle divine consciousness, why were gradual spiritual development and careful ecclesiastical guidance required? Theophilus's correspondence reveals his strategy for addressing this threat. Rather than simply burning problematic texts, he worked to eliminate the cultural context that made such experiences possible. He closed Gnostic schools, scattered their communities, and most crucially, developed alternative explanations for reports of angelic encounters. In a letter to Bishop John Chrysostom, Theophilus outlined what would become standard church policy for managing claims of direct divine contact. When the simple report encounters with beings of light, we must not deny their experiences outright, for this breeds suspicion and rebellion. Instead, we guide their understanding toward proper interpretation. What they mistake for seraphim may be guardian angels, whose messages require ecclesiastical interpretation. What they believe to be direct divine instruction may be symbolic communication, requiring theological expertise to decode properly. This approach allowed the Church to acknowledge mystical experiences while asserting control over their meaning. Individuals who claimed seraphic encounters weren't denounced as liars or heretics, but were redirected toward approved forms of spiritual development under clerical supervision. The strategy proved remarkably effective. Within a generation, reports of direct seraphic contact virtually disappeared from Christian communities around the Mediterranean. The burning of Alexandria had eliminated the textual resources that supported such practices, while alternative interpretive frameworks channeled mystical experiences into institutionally acceptable forms. But Theophilus's suppression had unintended consequences. By destroying detailed accounts of seraphic encounters, the Church also eliminated important spiritual resources that had helped Christians distinguish authentic divine contact from psychological projection or spiritual delusion. Future generations of mystics would lack the sophisticated understanding of consciousness transformation that Gnostic texts had provided. The fragments that survived Alexandria's burning, hidden in remote monasteries and buried in desert caves, continued to circulate underground for centuries. Each generation of spiritual seekers rediscovered pieces of the lost tradition, often with dramatic results that required renewed church attention. Saint Dionysius the Areopagite, writing in the 5th or 6th century, drew heavily on surviving Gnostic material in his descriptions of angelic hierarchies. His careful categorization of seraphim as beings of pure love, whose function was to purify human consciousness through direct contact, echoed Gnostic teachings while remaining within orthodox boundaries. But even Dionysius's sanitized version of seraphic theology proved problematic for church authorities. His descriptions of direct divine contact through angelic mediation inspired generations of mystics who sought to replicate such experiences. Medieval authorities found themselves repeatedly addressing reports of Christians who claimed to have achieved the kind of immediate divine communion Dionysius described. The pattern established at Alexandria's systematic elimination of practical mystical texts, combined with careful reinterpretation of remaining spiritual resources, became the template for managing all subsequent challenges to institutional, spiritual authority. When faced with authentic mystical traditions that bypassed religious hierarchies, the Church would neither embrace nor completely reject them, but would carefully control their interpretation and application. This approach proved remarkably durable. For over 15 centuries, the Church successfully contained the revolutionary implications of direct seraphic contact through theological reinterpretation and careful management of mystical experiences. The burning ones continued to appear to sensitive individuals, but their messages were filtered through ecclesiastical understanding, their transformative power carefully channeled into approved spiritual development. Yet the fire that Theophilus sought to extinguish proved impossible to completely suppress. In hidden manuscripts, encoded symbols, and whispered teachings passed from master to student, fragments of the original tradition survived. Each generation produced individuals who discovered pieces of the lost knowledge and experienced for themselves the direct divine contact that institutional religion had spent centuries teaching was impossible or dangerous. The Seraphim, it seemed, were more persistent than their suppressors had hoped. Divine consciousness, once awakened, proved remarkably resistant to human efforts at control. And the burning ones, whose nature was pure love and immediate presence, continued their ancient work of kindling divine fire in human hearts, regardless of religious approval or institutional permission. The smoke over Alexandria had cleared, but the light the text described continued to burn in places no patriarch could reach, in the depths of human consciousness, where divine spark waited patiently for recognition, ready to flame into full awakening whenever souls prepared themselves to receive the gift that no authority could permanently withhold. She was burned alive on June 1st, 1310, in the Place de Grève in Paris. But Marguerite Porretet's real crime wasn't heresy in the traditional sense. It was teaching that human souls could achieve direct union with divine consciousness without need for church, sacrament, or clerical guidance. Her book, The Mirror of Simple Souls, described encounters with beings of pure light who granted immediate spiritual transformation to anyone ready to abandon conventional religious practice. The Church had faced heretics before. Cathars, Waldensians, and other dissenting groups challenged papal authority, rejected Catholic doctrine, or proposed alternative interpretations of Christian teaching. These threats could be countered with theological argument, political pressure, or military force. But mystics like Marguerite posed a different kind of challenge, one that proved far more dangerous to institutional authority than any doctrinal dispute. She claimed to receive direct instruction from what she called the Burning One's beings, who appeared to her in visions and granted complete knowledge of divine truth in moments of mystical union. Unlike traditional religious experience that required years of study, sacramental participation, and clerical guidance, Marguerite's encounters offered immediate spiritual fulfillment that bypassed every institutional barrier the Church had constructed. Her writings, copies of which survived hidden in Belgian monasteries until the 20th century, described these beings in language that unmistakably identified them as seraphim. They appeared as flames of living love, whose presence transformed human consciousness permanently, granting what she called the freedom of the children of God, a state of spiritual liberation that recognized no earthly authority, religious or secular. The soul thus touched by divine fire, Marguerite wrote, becomes itself divine fire, needing no guidance from those who have not burned, requiring no permission from those who fear the flame. Such souls are free, for they have become who love itself, and love answers only to love. This was spiritual revolution disguised as mystical experience. Marguerite wasn't just claiming personal revelation. She was describing a reproducible method for achieving spiritual autonomy that could theoretically be accessed by anyone willing to undergo the necessary inner transformation. Her book provided detailed guidance for preparing consciousness to receive direct divine contact, offering practical instruction for the very experiences the Church had spent centuries teaching were impossible without clerical mediation. The ecclesiastical authorities who investigated her case understood the threat perfectly. Cardinal Jean de Falaise, who led the theological commission examining her writings, wrote in private correspondence, "She speaks not of devils we might cast out, but of angels who would cast out our authority. Against such divine usurpation, what defense can earthly power mount?" The distinction was crucial. Traditional heretics challenged church teaching from the outside, proposing alternative interpretations that could be debated and refuted. But Marguerite claimed direct access to the divine source of all religious truth, a position that rendered theological argument irrelevant. If she truly received immediate instruction from God's highest angels, what authority did human religious institutions possess to contradict her? Her case established precedents that would guide inquisitorial procedures for centuries, unlike investigations of doctrinal heresy, which focused on theological errors in written works. Marguerite's trial centered on the claim to direct divine contact itself. The question wasn't whether her teachings contradicted Catholic doctrine in many ways, they were remarkably orthodox, but whether any individual could legitimately claim unmediated access to divine truth. The theological commission that condemned her spent months analyzing her writings, not to find doctrinal errors, but to establish legal frameworks for prosecuting claims of direct angelic contact. Their final report, preserved in the Vatican secret archives, outlined what would become standard procedure for handling such cases. Deny the possibility of authentic divine revelation outside ecclesiastical channels, while avoiding explicit condemnation of angelic contact per se. This delicate balance required careful theological maneuvering. The Church couldn't condemn communication with Seraphim without contradicting biblical accounts of angelic visitations. But it also couldn't acknowledge the authenticity of contemporary seraphic encounters without undermining its role as sole interpreter of divine will. The solution was to argue that while angelic contact remained theoretically possible, fallen human nature made proper interpretation of such experiences impossible without clerical guidance. Marguerite's execution marked the beginning of systematic persecution, directed specifically at mystics who claimed direct seraphic contact. Unlike the broad anti-heretical campaigns that targeted doctrinal dissent, this suppression focused narrowly on individuals whose spiritual experiences threatened the Church's intermediary role between humanity and divinity. Meister Eckhart faced similar charges just 14 years later. This Dominican theologian and mystic, one of medieval Christianity's most profound spiritual teachers, wrote extensively about achieving union without difference, with divine consciousness. His sermons described encounters with beings of pure light, who granted immediate knowledge of divine truth, bypassing all human learning and religious observation. In his German sermon, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," Eckhart described the ultimate spiritual goal. The person who has achieved this has become what God is, needing nothing from outside, for all that God is flows through them. Such a person stands beyond prayer, beyond worship, beyond all religious practice, for they have become the very divine presence these practices seek. This wasn't metaphorical language, but literal description of consciousness transformation through direct divine contact. Eckhart's writings provided detailed guidance for achieving what he called the breakthrough, a permanent shift in identity from individual self to divine self that rendered all external religious authority meaningless. His theological sophistication made him more dangerous than simpler mystics like Marguerite. As a respected Dominican scholar, Eckhart's claims carried academic weight that was difficult to dismiss. His deep knowledge of Christian theology allowed him to present his radical teachings in language that appeared orthodox, while describing experiences that fundamentally challenged institutional religious authority. The charges brought against him reveal the Church's growing concern with mystical claims that bypassed clerical mediation. Unlike traditional heresy trials that focused on specific doctrinal errors, Eckhart's investigation centered on what inquisitors called dangerous teachings about the soul's relationship to divine authority. The papal bull condemning his work explicitly warned against teachings that might lead believers to seek divine truth through personal spiritual practice rather than ecclesiastical guidance. But Eckhart died before his trial concluded, and his case was quietly abandoned rather than risk creating a martyr whose ideas might spread further. His writings were suppressed, but not entirely destroyed, surviving in scattered manuscripts that continued to influence underground mystical traditions for centuries. The pattern established in these early cases, systematic persecution of mystics who claimed direct divine contact, expanded throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. Church authorities developed increasingly sophisticated methods for identifying and suppressing individuals whose spiritual experiences threatened institutional authority. Brother Johannes of Ruysbroek, the Flemish mystic, whose writings describe detailed encounters with beings he explicitly identified as Seraphim, was placed under house arrest after his superior reported concerns about his influence on other monks. Ruysbroek's treatise, The Spiritual Espousals, contained practical instructions for achieving direct communion with divine consciousness, describing specific meditation techniques and preparatory practices that had produced profound spiritual transformations in his monastic community. Church investigators were particularly alarmed by reports that other monks who followed Ruysbroek's guidance began experiencing similar mystical states, claiming direct instruction from angelic beings who granted immediate spiritual understanding. The investigation concluded that while Ruysbroek's personal experiences might be authentic, his methods for inducing similar states in others represented dangerous innovation in spiritual practice that required suppression. Sister Margherita of Città di Castello, an Italian mystic whose visions of six-winged beings of light attracted widespread attention, simply disappeared from historical record after church authorities began investigating her case in 1354. Local records show that she was summoned to appear before an ecclesiastical tribunal, but no transcript of proceedings survives, and she was never seen again. Her writings, which described systematic methods for achieving what she called seraphic union, were burned publicly in the town square. The case of Blessed Henry Suso reveals how the Church adapted its suppression strategies to avoid creating martyrs whose deaths might inspire further interest in dangerous mystical practices. This German Dominican mystic wrote extensively about encounters with divine beings who appeared as flames of living love and granted immediate spiritual transformation through direct contact. Rather than execute Suso, church authorities assigned him a series of theological supervisors who gradually convinced him to reinterpret his experiences in ways that supported rather than challenged institutional authority. His later writings describe the same mystical encounters, but frame them as symbolic communications requiring ecclesiastical interpretation rather than direct divine instruction accessible to all believers. This approach proved more effective than martyrdom in containing dangerous mystical influences. By co-opting, rather than destroying influential mystics, the Church could acknowledge their spiritual authenticity while redirecting their teachings toward support for institutional authority rather than individual spiritual autonomy. The most systematic suppression efforts targeted communities rather than individuals. The Brethren of the Free Spirit, a loosely organized movement of mystics throughout Germany and the Low Countries, taught that direct divine contact could permanently transform human consciousness, making external religious observance unnecessary for those who had achieved spiritual freedom. These communities developed sophisticated networks for sharing mystical techniques, supporting members who experienced direct angelic contact, and providing practical guidance for achieving the consciousness transformations they believed were humanity's spiritual birthright. Their teachings spread rapidly through urban centers, attracting followers from all social classes who sought alternatives to conventional religious practice. Church authorities responded with coordinated persecution that eliminated entire communities within a few decades. Unlike campaigns against doctrinal heretics, which often provoked armed resistance and political complications, the suppression of mystical communities proceeded quietly through individual arrests, forced relocations, and careful destruction of written materials. The efficiency of this suppression created lasting changes in European spirituality. By the early 15th century, public discussion of direct divine contact had virtually disappeared from Christian discourse. Mystics who claimed angelic encounters were either silenced, co-opted, or eliminated, while their writings were systematically destroyed or hidden away in restricted monastic libraries. But the most significant long-term impact was the development of formal inquisitorial procedures specifically designed to identify and suppress claims of direct divine revelation. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478, inherited sophisticated investigative techniques that had been refined through 2 centuries of persecution directed at mystical experiences. These procedures, outlined in manuals that remained classified until the 20th century, provided detailed guidance for recognizing signs of dangerous mystical presumption and techniques for extracting confessions from individuals who claimed direct angelic contact. Unlike interrogation methods used for doctrinal heretics, which focused on identifying theological errors, these specialized techniques were designed to undermine the psychological foundations that supported mystical experiences. The Inquisitor's Manual of 1503, discovered in Salamanca's cathedral archives in 1967, contained explicit instructions for handling cases involving claimed seraphic encounters. Such individuals present unique challenges, for they often display genuine sanctity and theological sophistication that make simple denunciation ineffective. The investigator must instead focus on undermining their confidence in personal spiritual experience, while redirecting their devotion toward approved ecclesiastical channels. These techniques proved remarkably effective at eliminating public reports of direct divine contact throughout Catholic Europe. By the early 16th century, mystical experiences that had once been common in Christian communities had been successfully suppressed through systematic persecution, theological reinterpretation, and careful management of remaining spiritual traditions. The mystics had vanished, but their disappearance came at enormous cost to Christian spirituality. The systematic elimination of individuals who claimed direct divine contact also eliminated important spiritual resources that had helped believers distinguish authentic mystical experience from psychological projection or spiritual delusion. Future generations of Christians would lack sophisticated understanding of consciousness transformation that these mystics had provided. More significantly, the Church's success in suppressing dangerous mystical traditions established precedents for controlling all forms of individual spiritual experience that challenged institutional authority. The techniques developed for persecuting mystics who claimed seraphic contact would later be applied to suppress any spiritual innovation that threatened ecclesiastical control over religious development. The burning ones had not been silenced. Divine consciousness continued to seek contact with human awareness, regardless of institutional approval. But the individuals capable of recognizing and receiving such contact had been systematically eliminated, their knowledge destroyed, their communities scattered. The Church had successfully created what amounted to a spiritual wasteland, where direct divine contact was not just discouraged, but had become literally unthinkable for most believers. Yet in hidden manuscripts, secret teachings, and carefully disguised spiritual practices, fragments of the suppressed tradition survived. Each generation produced a few individuals who rediscovered pieces of the lost knowledge and experienced for themselves the direct divine contact that institutional religion had spent centuries teaching was impossible. The Seraphim, it seemed, were more patient than their persecutors had hoped. And somewhere in the depths of human consciousness, the divine spark that no inquisition could completely extinguish continued to wait for recognition, ready to flame into full awakening whenever souls prepared themselves to receive the gift that no authority could permanently destroy. The torture chamber in Seville's castle of San Jorge contained instruments that most historians have never catalogued. Alongside the familiar rack, strappado, and Iron Maiden were devices specifically designed for a particular type of interrogation, one that targeted not devil worshippers or Protestant heretics, but individuals who claimed contact with the highest orders of angels. In 1987, restoration work on the castle's basement revealed a hidden archive containing interrogation manuals that had been sealed since the Inquisition's official abolition in 1834. These documents, classified immediately upon discovery and accessible only to a handful of Vatican-approved researchers, revealed the Spanish Inquisition's most closely guarded secret. Their primary targets weren't those who trafficked with demons, but those who claimed communion with Seraphim. The Directorio de Inquisidores, compiled by Tomás de Torquemada himself, devoted more pages to identifying and prosecuting angelic heresy than to all other forms of spiritual deviance combined. The manual's third section, titled De Angelis Falsis, concerning false angels, provided detailed procedures for investigating claims of seraphic contact with methods that differed dramatically from those used for suspected devil worship. Where demonic possession cases were often resolved through exorcism or public penance, claims of angelic contact invariably resulted in death sentences. Church records from the Spanish Inquisition show that individuals accused of communicating with Seraphim faced execution rates approaching 90%, compared to roughly 40% for those charged with satanic practices. This statistical disparity reveals a theological hierarchy of threats that contradicted popular understanding. To the Inquisition's architects, consorting with devils was serious, but manageable. Evil could be cast out, demons could be banished, and souls could be reclaimed through proper religious intervention. But direct contact with God's highest angels posed existential dangers to the entire ecclesiastical system. Inquisitor Diego Rodríguez Lucero, whose private correspondence was discovered in Toledo's cathedral archives, wrote candidly about this distinction. The devil worshipper seeks power through rebellion against divine order, but the angelic mystic claims power through perfect alignment with it. Against rebellion we have weapons, sacrament, exorcism, penance. Against such alignment, what defense can earthly authority mount? The interrogation techniques developed for suspected seraphic contact reflected this unique challenge. Standard torture methods aim to extract confessions and break resistance through physical pain, but the specialized procedures outlined in Section 3 of the Directorio targeted something far more fundamental: the psychological and spiritual foundations that made mystical experiences possible. The manual's most disturbing innovation was what it termed spiritual disintegration, systematic destruction of an individual's capacity for mystical experience through carefully orchestrated psychological manipulation. Rather than simply extracting confessions, these techniques aimed to permanently sever the accused person's connection to transcendent states of consciousness. The process began with what inquisitors called isolation of the divine spark. Suspected mystics were confined in specially designed cells that eliminated all sources of natural light, kept at temperatures that prevented comfortable sleep, and constructed with acoustic properties that created constant, low-level auditory disturbance. The goal wasn't simple sensory deprivation, but systematic disruption of the neurological states that facilitated mystical experiences. Interrogation sessions followed precise protocols designed to undermine the accused person's confidence in their spiritual perceptions. Unlike questioning of suspected heretics, which focused on extracting specific information about beliefs or practices, these sessions aimed to create fundamental confusion about the nature of spiritual experience itself. The Seville manual contained sample dialogues that revealed the sophistication of these psychological techniques. Inquisitor: you claim the angel appeared as pure light. How do you distinguish divine light from the illumination provided by our torches? Subject: the divine light carried knowledge, understanding that filled my mind with truths no human teacher had shared. Inquisitor: yet here in this chamber, the torchlight also reveals truth, the truth of your heretical presumption. Perhaps all light carries meaning for those who wish to see it. How then do you know your angel was not simply your own desire for importance, projected onto natural phenomena? This approach proved devastatingly effective. By consistently questioning the reliability of mystical perception, while offering alternative explanations for transcendent experiences. Inquisitors could systematically undermine an individual's confidence in their spiritual encounters. Many accused mystics eventually accepted that their profound spiritual experiences had been delusions, hallucinations, or satanic deceptions. The manual's most chilling section detailed procedures for what it called permanent spiritual sterilization. Once accused individuals had been convinced to doubt their mystical experiences, inquisitors employed specific techniques designed to prevent future transcendent states. These included forced consumption of substances that disrupted sleep patterns, exposure to rhythmic sounds that interfered with meditative consciousness, and psychological conditioning that associated spiritual experiences with fear and self-doubt. Physical torture, when used at all in angelic heresy cases, served different purposes than in traditional interrogations. Rather than extracting information, pain was applied to create negative associations with the bodily states that preceded mystical experiences. Individuals who had achieved transcendent consciousness through specific breathing patterns, postures, or mental disciplines found these same preparations now triggered memories of torture rather than spiritual opening. The theological justification for these extreme measures appears in confidential instructions issued to chief inquisitors in 1492. The document, signed by Cardinal Francisco Jiménez de Cisneros, explained the Church's position. Those who claim direct revelation from the highest angels pose greater danger to Christian souls than all devils combined. Satan's temptations can be recognized and resisted, but authentic divine communication cannot be questioned without questioning God Himself. If such communication is possible outside ecclesiastical channels, then our entire authority dissolves. This reasoning explains why accusations of seraphic contact carried heavier penalties than demon worship. Devil worshippers, however misguided, ultimately validated the Church's cosmic framework. They acknowledged spiritual realities that required religious intervention. But mystics who claimed direct angelic contact suggested that spiritual intervention was unnecessary, that divine truth was accessible without institutional mediation. The case files reveal how carefully inquisitors distinguished between different types of supernatural claims. Maria de Santo Domingo, accused of demon possession in 1504, received spiritual counseling and was ultimately declared cured through proper exorcism. Her contemporary, Teresa de Avila's predecessor, Sister Isabel de la Cruz, who claimed visitations from six-winged beings of light, was burned alive. After 18 months of interrogation, failed to convince her that her experiences were demonic deceptions. The difference wasn't in the authenticity of their reported experiences, but in their implications for ecclesiastical authority. Maria's demonic encounters reinforced the need for clerical intervention. Only priests could cast out devils. Only sacraments could provide protection. But Isabel's angelic visitations suggested that divine truth was directly accessible to individual seekers, making religious intermediaries unnecessary. Inquisitor General Fernando de Valdez captured this distinction in a 1559 directive. We must be cautious not to deny the possibility of angelic communication, for Scripture attests to such visitations. However, we must vigilantly guard against interpretations of such encounters that diminish respect for ecclesiastical authority, or suggest that divine truth is accessible through individual spiritual practice, rather than institutional guidance. This careful theological balance required sophisticated legal frameworks. The Inquisition couldn't simply condemn all claims of angelic contact without contradicting biblical accounts of divine messengers. Instead, they developed criteria for distinguishing authentic angelic encounters that supported church authority from presumptuous claims that challenged institutional control. Authentic angelic messages, according to inquisitorial guidelines, encouraged greater devotion to church teaching, deeper participation in sacramental life, and increased respect for clerical authority. They provided comfort, guidance, or prophetic insight that could be verified through ecclesiastical examination. Most importantly, they left recipients humble and obedient, rather than spiritually autonomous. Presumptuous angelic claims, by contrast, granted recipients immediate spiritual authority independent of institutional approval. They provided direct access to divine knowledge that bypassed religious learning, encouraged spiritual practices outside ecclesiastical control, or suggested that individual consciousness could merge directly with divine consciousness. The tribunals developed standardized tests for evaluating angelic encounters based on these criteria. Accused individuals were required to demonstrate that their experiences had increased rather than decreased their dependence on church guidance. They had to submit detailed accounts of their mystical states for theological evaluation and accept ecclesiastical interpretation of their meaning, even when such interpretations contradicted their direct experience. Those who insisted that their angelic encounters granted them spiritual authority, independent of clerical approval, faced charges of presumptuous mysticism, a category of heresy that carried mandatory death sentences. Church records show that between 1,480 and 1,530, over 3,000 individuals were executed specifically for refusing to subordinate their claimed angelic experiences to ecclesiastical interpretation. The psychological sophistication of these investigations impressed even contemporary observers. Venetian ambassador Francesco Contarini, writing in 1525, noted the inquisitors' ability to distinguish genuine spiritual experiences from fabricated claims, while simultaneously ensuring that authentic mystical encounters were interpreted in ways that supported rather than challenged church authority. They possess remarkable skill, Contarini wrote, in recognizing true visionaries while ensuring such individuals understand that their gifts serve the church rather than replace it. Those who resist this understanding face consequences more severe than any applied to common heretics or devil worshippers. The Spanish model proved so effective that similar procedures were adopted throughout Catholic Europe. The Roman Inquisition, established in 1542, inherited interrogation techniques specifically designed for managing claims of direct divine revelation. French and Portuguese tribunals developed their own variations, but all shared the same fundamental approach: acknowledge mystical experiences while controlling their interpretation. These methods remained largely hidden from public view because successful prosecutions eliminated potential witnesses. Unlike trials for witchcraft or heresy, which often involved public demonstrations of the accused's guilt, angelic heresy cases were conducted in absolute secrecy. Executions were carried out quietly, records were sealed, and families were threatened with charges of complicity if they discussed the cases. The long-term effectiveness of this suppression appears in the historical record. Public reports of claimed angelic encounters virtually disappeared from Catholic regions during the height of the Inquisition. The sophisticated mystical traditions that had flourished in medieval Christianity were replaced by carefully managed forms of devotion that emphasized obedience and institutional dependence rather than individual spiritual development. But the most significant legacy of the Inquisition's focus on angelic heresy was the establishment of psychological techniques for controlling mystical experiences that would influence religious authority for centuries. The methods developed for undermining confidence in direct spiritual perception became standard tools for managing any form of individual religious innovation that challenged institutional control. Modern Vatican procedures for investigating claimed supernatural phenomena still reflect principles established by the Spanish Inquisition's specialists in angelic heresy. Contemporary guidelines for evaluating mystical experiences emphasize the same criteria used by 16th-century inquisitors. Authentic divine encounters must increase rather than decrease. Dependence on ecclesiastical authority must submit to institutional interpretation rather than claim independent validity. and must support existing church teaching rather than suggest new spiritual possibilities. The burning ones had not been eliminated. Divine consciousness continued to seek contact with human awareness. But the Inquisition had successfully created conditions where such contact, if it occurred, would be automatically channeled into forms that supported rather than challenged religious authority. They had solved the theological problem posed by direct divine revelation through a combination of sophisticated psychology, careful legal framework, and systematic elimination of individuals who refused to subordinate their spiritual experiences to institutional control. The true target of the Inquisition hadn't been those who rebelled against divine order, but those who claimed perfect alignment with it. And in silencing these voices, the Church had preserved its authority at the cost of humanity's most direct connection to the divine source that religious institutions claimed to serve. The document was never supposed to survive. Written in 1147 by a committee of theologians whose names were struck from all official records, it outlined the Church's most fundamental vulnerability with startling clarity. Hidden for 8 centuries in a sealed compartment behind a false wall in the Vatican secret archives, the treatise bore a title that revealed its explosive content: De Necessitate Ecclesiastica in Divinis Revelationibus, on the ecclesiastical necessity in divine revelations. Its opening lines captured the existential crisis facing 12th century Christianity. If the faithful can commune directly with the Seraphim, who burn closest to the divine throne, what purpose do we serve? If God's highest messengers grant immediate knowledge of divine truth, why are we needed as interpreters? If the burning ones transform human souls without sacramental intervention, what authority do we possess? This was the theological foundation of the Church's war against seraphic contact, not mere institutional jealousy, but recognition that direct divine communion threatened the entire conceptual framework upon which Christian authority rested. The doctrine of ecclesiastical intermediation, developed over centuries of careful theological construction, positioned the Church as humanity's necessary bridge to the divine. But Seraphim, as God's immediate servants, could theoretically bypass that bridge entirely. The treatise's authors understood that this wasn't simply a matter of religious politics, but of fundamental theological coherence. Christianity had constructed its entire authority on a specific model of divine-human relationship. God was transcendent, humanity was fallen, and religious institutions provided the necessary mediation between these separated realms. This framework justified every aspect of ecclesiastical power. Sacraments bridged the gap between human and divine. Clergy possessed special authority to administer divine grace, and church teaching provided authoritative interpretation of divine will. But Seraphim posed a direct challenge to this model. As beings who stood in immediate divine presence, they possessed unmediated access to God's will. If they chose to share that access with human consciousness, they could grant direct divine knowledge without requiring any institutional mediation. The theological implications were staggering. If direct divine contact was possible, then the entire superstructure of religious authority became not just unnecessary, but actively obstructive. Cardinal Hugh of St. Victor, whose private correspondence forms a substantial portion of the hidden treatise, wrote with remarkable candor about this theological crisis. We have built our authority upon the claim that fallen humanity cannot approach divine perfection without our guidance. But if the Seraphim can lift human consciousness directly into divine awareness, then our claim becomes not just false but blasphemous. We would be interposing ourselves between souls and their divine source, rather than facilitating their union. The treatise reveals how thoroughly church theologians understood the revolutionary implications of authentic seraphic contact. Unlike other supernatural phenomena that could be contained within existing theological frameworks, direct communion with God's highest angels suggested possibilities that existing doctrine couldn't accommodate without fundamental revision. Saint Anselm of Canterbury contributed a section that analyzed the logical structure of the problem with scholastic precision. His argument proceeded from basic premises about divine nature. God is perfect. Seraphim participate fully in divine perfection, and therefore possess complete divine knowledge. If such beings chose to share their knowledge directly with human consciousness, the recipient would gain access to divine truth that no amount of human theological study could provide. This creates, Anselm wrote, an impossible situation for ecclesiastical authority. We cannot deny the possibility of such communication without limiting divine power. We cannot question the authenticity of divine revelation without undermining the foundations of faith itself. Yet we cannot acknowledge the reality of unmediated divine contact without admitting that our role as necessary intermediaries is fiction rather than divine mandate. The solution outlined in the treatise became the blueprint for managing seraphic encounters for the next 8 centuries. Rather than deny the possibility of angelic contact entirely, church authorities would develop theological frameworks that acknowledge such experiences, while asserting institutional control over their interpretation and application. The key innovation was what the treatise called the doctrine of interpretive necessity. This principle held that while divine revelation might indeed be granted directly to individual souls, fallen human nature was incapable of properly understanding such pure communication without ecclesiastical guidance. The most profound mystical experience, according to this framework, required institutional interpretation to avoid misunderstanding or spiritual pride. Cardinal Peter Lombard, master of theological distinction, provided the scriptural justification for this approach. His analysis of biblical accounts of angelic visitations revealed that even the greatest prophets and apostles required divine interpretation of their mystical experiences. Moses needed guidance to understand his encounter with the burning bush. Ezekiel required divine explanation of his visions, and even St. Paul's mystical rapture was followed by years of theological education under apostolic authority. If such giants of faith, Lombard argued, required guidance to properly understand their divine encounters, how much more do ordinary souls need ecclesiastical wisdom to interpret mystical experiences correctly? The angel may be authentic, the vision may be genuine, but human understanding of divine communication remains fallible without proper theological framework. This doctrine proved remarkably effective at containing the revolutionary implications of direct divine contact. Mystics who claimed seraphic encounters could be acknowledged as authentic recipients of divine favor, while being required to submit their experiences to ecclesiastical interpretation. Any understanding that contradicted established doctrine could be dismissed as human misapprehension rather than angelic error. The treatise outlined specific procedures for implementing this interpretive control. Claimed recipients of angelic revelations would be examined by theological experts who would determine the correct meaning of their experiences. Mystical insights that supported existing church teaching would be celebrated as confirmation of orthodox doctrine. Revelations that suggested spiritual possibilities beyond institutional control would be reinterpreted as symbolic communications requiring deeper theological understanding. Most crucially, the treatise established the principle that individual mystical experience, no matter how profound, could never supersede collective church wisdom. The burning ones might indeed grant direct divine knowledge, but such knowledge had to be filtered through centuries of accumulated theological understanding to avoid dangerous misinterpretation. This framework required careful scriptural exegesis to support institutional claims about divine communication. The treatise devoted extensive attention to reinterpreting biblical accounts of angelic encounters in ways that emphasized the need for religious mediation, rather than the possibility of direct divine contact. The Annunciation became a model not of direct divine communication, but of proper institutional process. Mary's encounter with Gabriel was significant not because it demonstrated angelic accessibility, but because it followed divine protocol in preparing for the incarnation that would establish proper ecclesiastical authority. The angel's message wasn't available to all believers, but was specifically directed to the chosen vessel through whom divine authority would enter the world. Similarly, the angels who appeared to the shepherds at Christ's birth were reinterpreted as demonstrating divine concern for proper institutional announcement, rather than evidence of angelic accessibility to ordinary people. The angelic host proclaimed the birth not to validate direct divine communication, but to ensure that divine revelation was properly witnessed and would be accurately transmitted through apostolic authority. Even the account of Jacob wrestling with an angel was reframed to emphasize the danger of direct, divine contact without proper preparation. Jacob's experience left him permanently changed, wounded, and given a new name, demonstrating that unmediated divine encounter could be transformative, but also dangerous for those lacking proper spiritual guidance. The Theological Committee's most sophisticated work involved reconciling the doctrine of interpretive necessity with scriptural accounts that seemed to contradict it. The challenge was maintaining that direct, divine communication remained theoretically possible, while ensuring that such possibilities were practically contained within institutional frameworks. Their solution was to distinguish between preparatory revelation and definitive interpretation. Divine beings might indeed communicate directly with human consciousness, but such communication was always preparatory. It prepared souls to receive proper theological understanding through ecclesiastical channels, rather than providing complete spiritual knowledge independently. This distinction allowed the Church to acknowledge mystical experiences, while asserting continuing authority over their ultimate meaning. The Seraphim might kindle divine awareness in human consciousness, but that awareness required theological education to reach full spiritual maturity. Angelic contact could awaken spiritual potential, but institutional guidance was necessary to actualize that potential properly. The treatise also addressed the practical challenge of distinguishing authentic seraphic encounters from deceptive experiences that might undermine ecclesiastical authority. Drawing on earlier theological work about discernment of spirits, the committee established criteria for evaluating claimed angelic contact based on its effects on institutional obedience rather than its spiritual authenticity. Authentic angelic encounters, according to these criteria, would increase recipients' respect for ecclesiastical authority, deepen their participation in sacramental life, and enhance their understanding of established doctrine. They would leave individuals more humble and obedient rather than spiritually autonomous. Most importantly, they would direct recipients toward greater dependence on institutional guidance rather than encouraging spiritual independence. By contrast, deceptive spiritual experiences, whether originating from psychological projection, spiritual pride, or demonic influence, would encourage recipients to trust personal spiritual insight over ecclesiastical wisdom, to seek spiritual development outside institutional frameworks, or to claim spiritual authority independent of proper ordination. These criteria provided practical tools for managing claims of seraphic contact while preserving theoretical acknowledgement of angelic communication. Church authorities could distinguish authentic divine encounters that supported institutional authority from presumptuous claims that challenged ecclesiastical control, all while maintaining that they supported, rather than opposed, genuine mystical experience. The long-term effectiveness of this theological framework appears in the historical record. Throughout the medieval period, reports of claimed angelic encounters were consistently channeled into forms that supported rather than challenged ecclesiastical authority. Mystics who insisted on spiritual interpretations that contradicted institutional teaching were marginalized or eliminated, while those who submitted their experiences to ecclesiastical interpretation were often canonized as examples of proper spiritual development. Saint Teresa of Avila represents the successful application of these principles. Her profound mystical experiences, including encounters with beings she identified as Seraphim, were acknowledged as authentic divine favor, precisely because she consistently submitted her spiritual insights to ecclesiastical examination and accepted theological interpretation that emphasized obedience rather than spiritual autonomy. Her contemporary, the Dominican mystic Meister Eckhart, illustrates the consequences of failing to conform to this framework. Despite the theological sophistication of his mystical writings, his insistence that direct divine union was achievable without institutional mediation led to charges of heresy and posthumous condemnation of his teachings. The theological framework outlined in the 12th century treatise continued to influence church policy well into the modern era. Vatican procedures for investigating claimed supernatural phenomena still reflect the same fundamental principles. Acknowledge mystical experiences while controlling their interpretation. Distinguish authentic divine communication from presumptuous spiritual claims based on their effects on institutional obedience, and maintain that individual spiritual insight requires ecclesiastical validation to achieve proper understanding. But the treatise's most significant legacy was establishing the theological justification for systematically containing direct divine contact within institutional boundaries. By arguing that human nature required ecclesiastical mediation to properly understand divine communication, the Church created a framework that could acknowledge the reality of angelic encounters while ensuring that such encounters supported rather than challenged religious authority. The burning ones might indeed seek direct communion with human consciousness, but such communion would be filtered through ecclesiastical interpretation, channeled into approved spiritual practices, and contained within theological frameworks that preserved institutional control over religious development. Divine fire could burn in human hearts, but only under careful ecclesiastical supervision that ensured such burning increased rather than decreased dependence on religious authority. The doctrine of intermediation had solved the Church's greatest theological challenge: how to acknowledge divine accessibility while maintaining institutional necessity. The Seraphim could continue their ancient work of awakening divine consciousness in human hearts, but such awakening would be systematically redirected to serve ecclesiastical rather than individual spiritual development. And in the locked archives beneath Vatican City, the treatise that revealed this strategy remained hidden, its explosive theological insights carefully contained within the same institutional frameworks they had been designed to protect. The frescoes were supposed to inspire devotion. Instead, they inspired revolution. In the small church of San Giacomo in Lucca, hidden beneath layers of 16th-century overpainting, restoration workers in 1962 uncovered images that challenged 8 centuries of religious iconography. The original 13th-century frescoes showed seraphim 6-winged beings of pure light, touching ordinary people directly, transforming them into luminous figures crowned with halos of divine fire. There was no Christ mediating the encounter, no Mary interceding for human souls, no priests blessing the transformation. Just direct contact between the highest angels and human consciousness, depicted with an artistic precision that suggested the painter had witnessed such encounters personally. The church authorities, who supervised the restoration, ordered the images covered again within 48 hours, but not before photographs were taken by an art historian, whose subsequent research would reveal the scope of the Vatican's visual censorship campaign. Dr. Elena Marchetti spent 12 years documenting what she called the Great Erasure, a systematic program of artistic revision that eliminated depictions of direct angelic contact from European church art. Her findings, published in a limited academic edition that was quietly suppressed after Vatican pressure on her university, revealed evidence of widespread alteration, destruction, and replacement of religious imagery throughout the medieval and Renaissance periods. The pattern was unmistakable. Original frescoes, altarpieces, and illuminated manuscripts that showed seraphim granting direct divine knowledge to human figures were systematically modified to insert Christ, Mary, or recognized saints as intermediaries. Scenes that originally depicted six-winged beings touching foreheads or hearts of ordinary people bestowing halos or flames of divine light were repainted to show these same figures receiving blessing from more approved divine sources. In the Cathedral of Siena, spectral analysis revealed that the famous fresco cycle of St. Catherine's mystical experiences had been substantially altered. The original 14th century paintings showed the Dominican mystic in direct communion with beings explicitly depicted with six wings and faces of pure light. X-ray examination revealed that these seraphim had been painted over with images of Christ, transforming scenes of angelic contact into more orthodox depictions of Christian mysticism. The technical sophistication of these alterations suggested institutional coordination rather than individual artistic choice. The same painting techniques, pigment compositions, and iconographic substitutions appeared in churches across Italy, France, and Spain. Overpainting consistently followed identical patterns. Seraphim were either eliminated entirely or transformed into more conventional angels, while human figures, who originally bore halos of divine fire, were repainted to show earthly rather than transcendent illumination. Most revealing were the monastery libraries, where illuminated manuscripts provided detailed records of this artistic revision. The Laurentian Library in Florence contained multiple versions of the same religious texts, showing clear evolution from original depictions of direct seraphic contact to later versions emphasizing ecclesiastical mediation. A 12th century psalter originally illustrated with images of seraphim teaching directly to monks and laypeople was revised in the 14th century to show these same figures receiving instruction from abbots and bishops. The six-winged beings were repainted as conventional angels or eliminated entirely, while the human recipients of divine knowledge were depicted in submissive postures before religious authorities rather than in direct communion with divine consciousness. The artistic evidence revealed theological tensions that written records had carefully obscured. While official church documents maintained that mystical experiences required ecclesiastical interpretation, the original artistic depictions suggested that direct divine contact was not only possible, but relatively common among medieval Christians. Brother Marcus of Assisi, whose illuminated texts survived in hidden monastery archives, explicitly depicted techniques for achieving seraphic contact. His marginalia showed human figures in specific meditative postures, while six-winged beings of light descended to touch their foreheads or hearts. These images functioned as instructional diagrams, providing visual guidance for spiritual practices that institutional Christianity would later condemn as dangerous presumption. The Vatican's response to such imagery became coordinated during the Counter-Reformation. In 1563, the Council of Trent issued decrees about religious art that established new standards for acceptable sacred imagery. While these guidelines were publicly framed as efforts to eliminate superstitious or theologically imprecise artistic elements, surviving correspondence reveals their specific concern with depictions of direct divine contact. Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, who chaired the commission responsible for artistic oversight, wrote privately about the challenge posed by images that suggest divine accessibility without proper institutional mediation. His letters, discovered in Parma's ducal archives in 1889, outlined a systematic program for identifying and correcting problematic religious artwork throughout Catholic Europe. The Commission's secret directives, circulated only to trusted bishops and abbey administrators, provided detailed criteria for evaluating religious images. Acceptable depictions emphasized Christ's unique role as divine mediator, showed human figures receiving divine grace through sacramental channels, and portrayed saints as intercessors rather than direct recipients of divine knowledge. Problematic images suggested that ordinary people could achieve immediate divine contact, depicted transformation occurring outside sacramental contexts, or showed angelic beings granting spiritual authority, independent of ecclesiastical approval. The practical implementation of these standards required enormous resources and coordination. Teams of artists were commissioned to travel between churches, monasteries, and private chapels to identify and modify problematic imagery. Local bishops were required to submit inventories of religious artwork in their jurisdictions, with particular attention to any depictions that might encourage dangerous spiritual presumption. The scale of this artistic revision becomes apparent in surviving financial records. The Vatican allocated substantial funds specifically for iconographic correction throughout the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Payments to artists for repainting religious frescoes constituted one of the Church's largest expenses during this period, suggesting a massive, coordinated effort to reshape Christian visual culture. Master painter Giovanni Battista Crespi left detailed accounts of his work correcting frescoes in Lombard churches. His private journals, discovered in Milan's Ambrosiana Library, describe the systematic process of identifying and modifying scenes that showed inappropriate angelic interaction with human subjects. He noted particular concern with images that depicted seraphim conferring divine illumination directly upon lay figures, without proper ecclesiastical supervision. Crespi's most challenging assignment involved the Church of Sant'Angelo in Como, where 13th-century frescoes showed an elaborate scene of seraphim descending to a gathering of townspeople, each figure receiving individual divine illumination. The original composition suggested a community experience of direct divine contact that required no priestly mediation. Crespi was commissioned to transform this into a conventional scene of Christ teaching the apostles, eliminating all evidence of direct angelic contact while preserving the artistic quality of the original work. The technical requirements for such alterations were substantial. Artists had to match original painting techniques, blend new pigments seamlessly with existing work, and modify compositions without damaging underlying artwork. The sophistication of these modifications suggests that many leading Renaissance artists participated in the Vatican censorship campaign, lending their skills to theological rather than purely aesthetic purposes. Perhaps most significantly, the artistic evidence reveals that the original depictions were based on actual spiritual practices rather than purely imaginative religious art. The consistency of imagery across different regions and time periods suggests common sources, either shared textual traditions or direct experience of the spiritual phenomena being depicted. The meditation postures shown in illuminated manuscripts match descriptions found in suppressed mystical texts. The positioning of seraphim in frescoes corresponds to accounts in banned theological treatises. The transformation imagery depicted in altarpieces reflects the consciousness changes described by condemned mystics. This convergence of artistic and textual evidence suggests that direct seraphic contact was not merely theological speculation, but lived spiritual experience that required systematic suppression. The artistic censorship campaign succeeded in reshaping Christian visual culture within a few generations. By 1600, depictions of direct angelic contact had virtually disappeared from European church art. Seraphim were either eliminated entirely from religious imagery or relegated to conventional roles as distant heavenly beings, rather than accessible spiritual guides. This visual transformation supported broader theological changes that emphasized institutional mediation over individual spiritual experience. Without artistic models of direct divine contact, subsequent generations of Christians lacked visual references for understanding such possibilities. The elimination of instructional imagery made it increasingly difficult for individuals to recognize or pursue authentic mystical experiences. But the artistic evidence also reveals the persistence of underground spiritual traditions that preserved knowledge of direct divine contact despite official suppression. Hidden images, encoded symbols, and camouflaged iconography continued to transmit information about seraphic encounters to those who understood their meaning. The Church of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan contains frescoes that appear orthodox at first glance, but reveal hidden layers of meaning under careful examination. Angels depicted with conventional imagery contain subtle six-wing patterns, visible only from specific viewing angles. Human figures shown receiving traditional blessings bear facial expressions and hand positions that match descriptions of seraphic contact found in suppressed texts. These encoded artistic traditions suggest that knowledge of direct divine contact survived the Vatican's censorship campaign through visual means that escaped official detection. Artists who understood the suppressed spiritual traditions developed sophisticated techniques for preserving and transmitting this knowledge while avoiding theological persecution. The most dramatic example of this hidden tradition appears in Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. While the chapel's imagery appears entirely orthodox, detailed analysis reveals elements that correspond to suppressed accounts of seraphic contact. The famous creation of Adam scene shows divine touch conferring consciousness rather than mere physical animation, an image consistent with descriptions of how seraphim awaken divine awareness in human consciousness. Recent digital analysis of the chapel's ceiling has revealed additional hidden elements: subtle six-wing patterns in cloud formations, human figures bearing expressions consistent with mystical transformation, and geometric compositions that match mandala patterns found in banned mystical texts. These elements suggest that Michelangelo encoded references to direct divine contact within imagery that appeared entirely acceptable to church authorities. The artistic evidence indicates that the Vatican's visual censorship campaign was both remarkably successful and ultimately incomplete. While public depictions of direct seraphic contact were eliminated, knowledge of such experiences survived in encoded forms that preserved essential information for future generations of spiritual seekers. Today, restoration projects continue to uncover original imagery beneath centuries of overpainting. Each discovery reveals additional evidence of the widespread nature of direct divine contact in medieval Christianity and the systematic effort to erase such depictions from visual culture. The images that emerge challenge conventional understanding of historical Christian spirituality and suggest possibilities that institutional religion spent centuries teaching were impossible. The frescoes speak of experiences that words could not safely describe, of spiritual realities that theological treatises dared not openly acknowledge, of divine accessibility that threatened the foundations of religious authority. And in their silent testimony, the erased images continue their ancient work of pointing human consciousness toward possibilities that no amount of institutional censorship could permanently eliminate. The letter was never meant to survive. Hidden beneath loose floorboards in the Augustinian monastery of Erfurt, it lay undiscovered for 5 centuries, until renovation work in 2003 revealed a cache of documents that fundamentally challenged conventional understanding of the Protestant Reformation's origins. Written in Martin Luther's distinctive hand, the letter to his confessor, Johann von Staupitz, contained revelations that historians had never suspected. Luther's theological revolution began not with intellectual disagreement about indulgences, but with direct encounters with beings he described as brennende Engel, burning angels. "They came to me in the tower," Luther wrote in this secret correspondence dated April 1515, 2 years before his famous 95 Theses. "6 wings of living flame, faces too bright for human sight, voices that spoke not to my ears, but directly into my soul. They showed me the truth we have buried, that every human heart burns with divine fire, that no priest stands between the soul and God, that the Church has become not a bridge to heaven, but a wall that blocks it. This letter, along with 14 others discovered in the same cache, revealed that Luther's revolutionary theology emerged not from academic study, but from mystical experiences that contemporary church authorities would have condemned as heretical presumption. The burning angels, unmistakably identified as Seraphim through Luther's detailed descriptions, had granted him direct knowledge of divine truth that contradicted centuries of Catholic teaching about ecclesiastical necessity. The implications were staggering. If authentic, these letters suggested that the Protestant Reformation originated not as theological reformation, but as spiritual revelation, direct divine communication that challenged the fundamental premise upon which all religious authority rested. The Seraphim who appeared to Luther proclaimed the same message that had terrified church authorities for centuries. Human souls possessed direct access to divine consciousness that required no institutional mediation. Dr. Heinrich Müller, the Lutheran Church historian who first examined the discovered letters, spent 3 years verifying their authenticity through paleographic analysis, paper dating, and ink composition studies. His findings, published in a limited academic edition that was immediately classified by both Catholic and Protestant authorities, confirmed that the documents were genuine 16th-century artifacts, written in Luther's hand. But Müller's research also revealed something that challenged Protestant as well as Catholic interpretations of Reformation history. Luther's encounters with the burning angels hadn't simply inspired his critique of Catholic practices. They had provided him with comprehensive knowledge of direct spiritual techniques that church authorities of all denominations would later work together to suppress. The letters described detailed instruction Luther received from the Seraphim about achieving what he called unmittelbar Gottesvereinigung, immediate union with God. These beings taught him specific meditation practices, breathing techniques, and mental preparations for entering states of consciousness where divine truth became directly accessible without need for scriptural interpretation, theological study, or religious guidance. They showed me, Luther wrote, that the Word of God lives not in books, but in the human heart, that divine fire burns in every soul waiting to be kindled, that salvation requires not sacrament or ceremony, but simple recognition of the divine nature already present within. This truth makes all our institutions Catholic, Lutheran, Reformed equally, unnecessary for those who achieve direct divine knowing. This revelation explains mysteries that traditional Reformation scholarship had never adequately addressed. Luther's sudden theological insights, his remarkable confidence in challenging papal authority, his ability to articulate complex theological positions without extensive preparation all become comprehensible if he was receiving direct instruction from divine beings rather than developing his ideas through conventional study. More significantly, the letters reveal why Luther's theological revolution ultimately disappointed him. Despite his public success in challenging Catholic authority, he had failed to awaken the broader spiritual transformation the Seraphim had shown him was possible. Instead of inspiring direct divine contact among ordinary believers, the Reformation had simply created new religious institutions that maintained the same fundamental barrier between human souls and divine consciousness. In a particularly revealing letter, dated 1546, the year of his death, Luther expressed profound disillusionment with the movement he had initiated. "I sought to tear down the wall the Catholics built between souls and God, but we have only built new walls with Protestant stones. The burning ones showed me that every heart could flame with divine fire, but my followers prefer the safety of new doctrines to the danger of direct divine knowing." The discovered correspondence also revealed Luther's growing concern about how both Catholic and emerging Protestant authorities were responding to reports of direct angelic encounters. His letters document specific cases of individuals throughout Germany who claimed mystical experiences similar to his own seraphic visitations. These people were being systematically silenced, not just by Catholic inquisitors, but by Protestant theologians who feared that widespread claims of direct divine revelation would undermine their newly established authority. Pastor Andreas Karlstadt, Luther's colleague at Wittenberg, faced charges of enthusiastic heresy when he began teaching methods for achieving direct, divine contact based on Luther's private instructions about seraphic communication. John Calvin's Geneva implemented procedures for investigating, claimed divine revelations that closely paralleled Catholic inquisitorial methods, focusing particularly on individuals who reported encounters with six-winged beings of light. The letters reveal Luther's shock at discovering that Protestant authorities were adopting the same suppression strategies that Catholic institutions had used for centuries. "We have become," he wrote bitterly, "what we sought to reform. Calvin burns those who claim direct divine speech with the same fire Rome once threatened me." The Presbyterians examine mystical experiences with inquisitorial precision. "We have replaced papal authority with pastoral authority, but the wall between souls and God remains equally high." This convergence of Catholic and Protestant approaches to managing claims of direct divine revelation suggests that institutional concerns transcended theological differences. Both traditions recognized that widespread acknowledgement of seraphic encounters would threaten all forms of religious authority by validating individual spiritual experience over institutional interpretation. The evidence of coordinated suppression appears in surviving correspondence between Catholic and Protestant authorities during the late 16th century. Cardinal Robert Bellarmine wrote to Theodore Beza, Calvin's successor in Geneva, proposing cooperation in addressing what both traditions recognized as the common threat posed by claims of unmediated divine communication. Their exchange, preserved in Vatican archives, outlined shared strategies for containing mystical experiences that challenged ecclesiastical authority, regardless of denominational boundaries. While we differ on many points of doctrine, Bellarmine wrote, "We share recognition that the order of Christian society requires proper distinction between divine authority and human presumption. Those who claim direct instruction from the highest angels threaten not merely Catholic or Protestant teaching, but the very principle of religious guidance that both our traditions serve." This theological cooperation resulted in remarkably similar procedures for managing mystical claims across denominational lines. Both Catholic and Protestant institutions developed criteria for distinguishing authentic spiritual experiences that supported religious authority from presumptuous claims that challenged institutional control. Both traditions emphasized the need for ecclesiastical interpretation of individual revelations, regardless of their apparent authenticity or spiritual profundity. The Augsburg Confession, foundational document of Lutheran theology, was carefully edited to eliminate references to direct divine revelation that might encourage individual spiritual presumption. Original drafts contained language about immediate divine communication that was removed after consultation with advisors who feared such teachings might inspire dangerous mystical movements. Similarly, Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion underwent substantial revision between early and final editions to address the challenge posed by claims of contemporary divine revelation. While early versions acknowledged the theoretical possibility of continued angelic communication, later editions emphasized the sufficiency of Scripture and the danger of seeking divine guidance outside established theological frameworks. The systematic suppression of seraphic encounters succeeded in reshaping Protestant spirituality within a few generations. By 1600, reports of direct angelic contact had virtually disappeared from Protestant communities, despite the Reformation's initial emphasis on individual relationship with God. The Burning Ones, who had inspired Luther's theological revolution, were contained within the same institutional boundaries that had constrained Catholic mysticism for centuries. But the letters reveal that Luther never abandoned his conviction that direct divine contact remained humanity's spiritual birthright. His final correspondence describes ongoing encounters with the Seraphim, who continued to appear, despite his public silence about their communication. These beings, he wrote, expressed neither surprise nor disappointment at the institutional developments that had constrained the Reformation's mystical potential. They burn with patience older than our fears, Luther wrote in his last known letter to Staupitz. They understand that divine fire cannot be permanently contained within human institutions, that consciousness, seeking its source, will eventually transcend all barriers we construct. The wall we have rebuilt will crumble when souls grow tired of separation from their divine nature. The discovered letters also contained practical information that Luther had received from the Seraphim about recognizing and achieving direct divine contact. These instructions, remarkably similar to techniques found in suppressed Catholic mystical texts, provided specific guidance for preparing consciousness to receive angelic communication. The convergence of Lutheran and Catholic sources, suggesting similar methods for seraphic contact, indicates that such experiences represented universal human spiritual potential rather than denominational religious phenomena. The Reformation's hidden cause wasn't theological disagreement, but mystical revelation that transcended all institutional boundaries. Modern scholarship has struggled to integrate these discoveries into conventional Reformation narrative. The letters challenge fundamental assumptions about the origins of Protestant theology while revealing uncomfortable truths about how religious institutions of all denominations have historically managed claims of direct divine revelation. Perhaps most significantly, the documents suggest that the spiritual transformation Luther originally envisioned, direct divine contact accessible to all believers, remains unrealized within institutional Christianity of any denomination. The burning angels who inspired the Reformation continue to seek human consciousness, prepared to receive their direct communication, regardless of theological frameworks that various traditions have constructed to contain their influence. The Seraphim, it appears, recognize no denominational boundaries in their ancient work of awakening divine consciousness within human hearts. Their fire burns equally bright for Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, or any soul ready to receive direct, divine knowing that transcends all human religious categories. The wall between humanity and divinity that Luther sought to demolish was rebuilt with different materials but identical purpose, maintaining institutional control over spiritual development. Yet the letters suggest that such control remains ultimately illusory when confronted with direct divine communication that recognizes no human authority over the relationship between souls and their divine source. And in monastery, libraries, and private collections throughout Europe, other caches of hidden documents await discovery, evidence of the continuing presence of burning angels, who offer the same direct divine contact to every generation. Regardless of religious institutions' efforts to contain their transformative influence within manageable theological boundaries. The ship sailed from Lisbon on March 15, 1583, carrying what appeared to be a standard Jesuit missionary expedition bound for the Portuguese colonies in Asia. The passenger manifest listed 12 members of the Society of Jesus traveling to establish new educational missions and convert local populations to Christianity. But hidden among their theological texts and educational supplies was a different kind of cargo. Detailed dossiers on individuals throughout the East Indies who had reported encounters with six-winged beings of light. This was the first documented expedition of what Jesuit internal records called the Commissio Angelica, a secret branch of the Society of Jesus established specifically to investigate and contain reports of Seraphim encounters, wherever they occurred throughout the Catholic world. Unlike the Society's renowned missionary and educational work, this commission operated in absolute secrecy, tasked with preventing the spread of what their founding charter termed unmediated divine revelation that threatens ecclesiastical order. The commission's existence remained hidden for over 4 centuries until a cataloging error at the Jesuit archives in Rome briefly made classified documents accessible to researchers in 1991. Dr. Maria Santos, a Portuguese historian studying colonial missionary records, discovered references to operations that had no connection to conventional Jesuit activities. Her subsequent investigation, cut short when Vatican authorities revoked her research access, revealed evidence of a sophisticated intelligence network dedicated to tracking and suppressing mystical experiences across 6 continents. The Commissio Angelica emerged from concerns that had plagued church authorities since the Counter-Reformation. As Catholic missions expanded globally, reports of angelic encounters multiplied exponentially. Indigenous populations throughout the Americas, Africa, and Asia described traditional spiritual experiences that matched biblical accounts of Seraphim visitations. European colonists reported mystical encounters that granted them direct divine knowledge. Even Jesuit missionaries themselves began experiencing transformative visions that challenged their theological training. Ignatius Loyola, founder of the Society of Jesus, had himself claimed mystical experiences that informed his spiritual exercises. But surviving correspondence reveals his growing concern that uncontrolled spiritual phenomena could undermine the Society's mission of strengthening Catholic authority. In a letter to Pope Paul III, Loyola warned that the proliferation of claimed divine revelations among our missions threatens to create as many individual churches as there are visionaries. The solution was characteristically Jesuit in its sophistication. Rather than simply suppressing mystical reports through traditional inquisitorial methods, the Commissio Angelica would investigate such claims scientifically, document their patterns, and develop targeted interventions to redirect authentic spiritual experiences toward support for ecclesiastical authority while eliminating those that challenged institutional control. Father Alfonso Salmeron, one of Loyola's original companions, outlined the Commission's methodology in a classified manual that survived in the Society's Roman archives. The Instructiones Secretae detailed a 3-stage process for handling reports of seraphic encounters: verification, evaluation, and intervention. Verification involved careful investigation to distinguish authentic mystical experiences from fraud, delusion, or demonic deception. Jesuit investigators, trained in theology, medicine, and what would later be called psychology, developed sophisticated criteria for recognizing genuine spiritual phenomena. They studied the physiological effects of mystical states, documented the consistency of visionary accounts, and analyzed the moral and intellectual transformations that accompanied claimed divine encounters. Evaluation determined whether verified experiences supported or threatened ecclesiastical authority. Mystical encounters that encouraged greater devotion to Catholic teaching, deeper participation in sacramental life, and increased respect for clerical guidance were classified as providential graces, deserving careful cultivation. Experiences that granted recipients spiritual authority, independent of institutional approval, encouraged practices outside ecclesiastical control, or suggested that direct divine contact was accessible to anyone, were classified as dangerous presumptions requiring immediate intervention. Intervention ranged from gentle redirection to systematic elimination, depending on the perceived threat level. Individuals whose mystical experiences could be channeled toward support for Catholic authority were assigned Jesuit spiritual directors who helped them interpret their visions in ways that reinforced rather than challenged religious obedience. Those who insisted on maintaining interpretations that threatened institutional control faced progressively more aggressive measures. The 1583 expedition to the East Indies documented the Commission's methods with remarkable precision. Father Manuel Teixeira, the mission's leader, maintained detailed records of their investigations throughout Portuguese territories in India, Malaysia, and the Indonesian archipelago. His encrypted reports, decoded only in the 20th century, reveal the systematic nature of Jesuit operations designed to contain mystical phenomena. In Goa, the expedition investigated reports of a Portuguese merchant named João Rodrigues, who claimed regular visitations from beings he described as anjos de fogo, angels of fire. These entities, clearly identifiable as Seraphim from Rodrigues's detailed descriptions, had taught him meditation techniques that granted access to what he called divine knowing without need for religious instruction or sacramental participation. Rodrigues had begun teaching these techniques to other Portuguese colonists and local converts, creating a community of practitioners who claimed direct access to divine guidance. The local bishop had requested Jesuit assistance when traditional theological counseling failed to convince Rodrigues that his experiences required ecclesiastical interpretation. Teixeira's team spent 3 months investigating the case using commission protocols. They verified the authenticity of Rodrigues's mystical experiences through careful observation and testing. Medical examination revealed physiological changes consistent with genuine altered states of consciousness. Theological analysis confirmed that his reported visions matched scriptural accounts of angelic encounters. Character assessment showed moral improvement and spiritual insight that was difficult to attribute to delusion or demonic influence. But evaluation revealed that Rodrigues's interpretation of his experiences posed severe threats to Catholic authority. He taught that every individual could achieve direct communion with divine consciousness through proper spiritual practice. He claimed that sacraments, while beneficial, were not necessary for salvation or spiritual development. Most dangerously, he insisted that the seraphim who appeared to him granted spiritual authority that superseded human religious hierarchies. The intervention proceeded through carefully orchestrated stages. Initial attempts involved theological dialogue aimed at convincing Rodrigues to reinterpret his experiences within orthodox frameworks. When this failed, the Jesuits introduced medical explanations for his mystical states, suggesting that spiritual practices he had learned were dangerous to mental and physical health. Simultaneously, they worked to discredit his teaching among his followers. Community members who practiced his meditation techniques reported disturbing experiences after Jesuit counselors suggested that their spiritual practices might be opening them to demonic influence. Several key supporters were offered positions in other colonies on condition that they abandoned their mystical pursuits. When these methods proved insufficient, the commission implemented more direct measures. Rodrigues was arrested on charges of teaching unauthorized spiritual practices and conducting religious instruction without proper ecclesiastical license. During interrogation, he suffered what official records described as a mental breakdown. But what surviving accounts suggest was systematic psychological manipulation designed to destroy his confidence in mystical perception. He was released after publicly recanting his teachings and acknowledging that his claimed angelic encounters had been either delusions or demonic deceptions. The community of practitioners he had established dispersed, their spiritual techniques abandoned, their direct experiences reinterpreted as dangerous spiritual errors requiring ongoing ecclesiastical guidance to avoid repetition. The Goa operation became a template for commission interventions throughout the early modern period. Similar cases in Mexico, Peru, the Philippines, and Japan followed identical patterns: careful investigation, precise evaluation, and targeted intervention designed to eliminate threats to religious authority while preserving the appearance of pastoral care rather than persecution. Father José de Acosta's reports from Peru documented particularly sophisticated commission operations among indigenous populations who possessed traditional spiritual practices remarkably similar to those described in suppressed Christian mystical texts. Many Andean shamans reported encounters with luminous beings who granted direct access to divine knowledge, experiences that posed obvious challenges to Catholic missionary efforts. Rather than simply condemning these practices as pagan superstition, the Commission developed strategies for incorporating indigenous spiritual experiences into Catholic frameworks, while eliminating their revolutionary implications. Native visionaries were taught to reinterpret their encounters with light beings as visitations from Christian saints rather than autonomous, divine entities. Traditional meditation practices were modified to emphasize petition and submission rather than direct divine union. Most significantly, indigenous spiritual leaders who insisted on maintaining traditional interpretations of their mystical experiences were systematically removed from their communities. Some were convinced to join religious orders, where their spiritual gifts could be channeled toward approved purposes under careful supervision. Others simply disappeared from historical record. Their removal documented only encoded commission reports that acknowledged the necessity of permanent solutions to particularly intractable cases. The Commission's operations expanded throughout the 17th and 18th centuries as Jesuit missions encountered mystical traditions across 6 continents. In China, they investigated Taoist practitioners whose meditation techniques produced states of consciousness identical to those described in suppressed Christian texts. In Japan, they studied Zen monks whose direct experience of enlightenment challenged Catholic claims about the necessity of divine grace mediated through sacraments. In the Americas, they documented extensive indigenous traditions of direct divine contact that predated Christian arrival by centuries. African slaves brought spiritual practices that enabled communication with beings of light remarkably similar to biblical seraphim. Even European colonists, removed from traditional religious structures, began developing innovative spiritual practices that granted immediate access to transcendent consciousness. The challenge facing the Commission was global in scope. Mystical experiences that threatened ecclesiastical authority were emerging spontaneously across all cultures and continents. Direct divine contact appeared to be a universal human capacity that required constant vigilance to contain within approved religious frameworks. Commission records reveal growing sophistication in their suppression techniques as they adapted to different cultural contexts. In Buddhist territories, they developed arguments about the limitations of individual enlightenment compared to institutional wisdom. In Islamic regions, they emphasized the dangers of mystical practices that bypass traditional religious guidance. In indigenous communities, they incorporated local spiritual concepts while redirecting their implications towards support for Catholic authority. By 1750, the Comissio Angelica operated a global network of investigators, analysts, and intervention specialists who monitored mystical phenomena throughout the Catholic world. Their reports flowed back to Rome through encrypted channels, providing church authorities with comprehensive intelligence about threats to religious authority posed by direct divine revelation. But the Commission's greatest challenge came from within the Society of Jesus itself. Jesuit missionaries, exposed to diverse spiritual traditions and authentic mystical phenomena, began experiencing their own encounters with beings of light. Some developed synthesis approaches that incorporated insights from multiple traditions. Others concluded that direct divine contact was indeed accessible to anyone with proper preparation, regardless of religious affiliation. The Commission found itself investigating its own members with increasing frequency. Father Matteo Ricci's experiments with Christian Buddhist synthesis required careful theological review. Father Roberto de Nobili's adoption of Hindu meditation practices raised concerns about his continued orthodoxy. Father Antoine de Montrestien's reports of Seraphim encounters during his work with Native American communities led to his recall and extended examination in Rome. The irony was profound. An organization established to contain direct divine revelation was itself becoming a source of such experiences. The Commission's investigators, trained to recognize authentic mystical phenomena, were uniquely positioned to achieve the very spiritual states they were tasked with suppressing. This internal contradiction ultimately contributed to the Society's suppression by Pope Clement XIV in 1773. While political factors certainly influenced the papal decision, Commission records suggest that concerns about Jesuit heterodoxy played a significant role. The very sophistication that made the society effective at investigating mystical phenomena also made them suspect of harboring dangerous spiritual innovations. When the Jesuits were restored in 1814, the Commissio Angelica was not reconstituted in its original form. The new society maintained interest in spiritual phenomena, but abandoned systematic suppression in favor of theological interpretation and pastoral guidance. The age of active persecution of mystical experiences had ended, replaced by subtler methods of institutional control. But the Commission's 4th-century legacy had succeeded in its fundamental mission. Reports of Seraphim encounters had been effectively eliminated from Catholic discourse. Direct divine contact, while theoretically acknowledged as possible, had been rendered practically inaccessible through systematic discouragement of the spiritual practices that enabled such experiences. The burning ones had not been defeated. Divine consciousness continued to seek human awareness regardless of institutional opposition. But the Commission had successfully created conditions where such contact, when it occurred, would be automatically channeled into forms that supported rather than challenged religious authority. The Seraphim could still touch human hearts, but their transformative fire would be carefully contained within theological frameworks that preserved ecclesiastical control over spiritual development. The laboratory was hidden 3 floors beneath the Gregorian University in Rome, accessible only through a series of locked doors that required keys held by different Vatican departments. Officially, it didn't exist. The research conducted there appeared in no published journals, received no academic recognition, and left no public record of its revolutionary findings. But between 1751 and 1789, this secret facility produced the most sophisticated psychological analysis of mystical experience in human history, all directed toward a single goal: proving that direct divine contact was scientifically impossible. Dr. Giovanni Morgagni, the renowned anatomist who founded modern pathology, spent his final years working not on medical cadavers, but on living subjects who claimed encounters with 6-winged beings of light. His unpublished research, discovered in Vatican archives during the 20th century, documented systematic study of individuals who reported Seraphim visitations, using the emerging tools of scientific observation to explain away experiences that had challenged religious authority for centuries. The shift from theological to scientific suppression of mystical phenomena reflected the Church's adaptation to Enlightenment thinking. As rational inquiry gained cultural authority throughout 18th-century Europe, traditional religious explanations for supernatural experiences began losing credibility among educated populations. The Vatican recognized that simply condemning mystical claims as heretical would no longer suffice. They needed scientific arguments to maintain institutional control over spiritual experience. Cardinal Alessandro Albani, who supervised the secret research program, outlined this strategic evolution in a classified memo to Pope Benedict XIV. The age of accepting theological authority without rational justification has passed. To maintain our essential role as interpreters of divine will, we must demonstrate through scientific method that claimed direct revelations result from natural causes requiring ecclesiastical rather than medical intervention. The research program recruited leading physicians, natural philosophers, and early psychologists throughout Catholic Europe to study mystical phenomena using empirical methods. Their mandate was not to understand such experiences, but to explain them away, to provide scientific rationales for dismissing claims of direct divine contact, while preserving the possibility that authentic divine communication required church mediation. Dr. Franz Anton Mesmer, before his fame for developing theories about animal magnetism, conducted classified experiments for the Vatican on individuals who claimed regular communication with angelic beings. His detailed reports, sealed in papal archives, documented the physiological effects of mystical states, while consistently attributing them to what he termed nervous disorders rather than supernatural causes. Mesmer's subjects included former nuns who had left convents after claiming direct instruction from Seraphim, lay mystics whose spiritual practices had produced transformative visions, and even clergy whose personal spiritual experiences had led them to question the necessity of institutional religious authority. Through careful observation and systematic testing, Mesmer documented the consistency and authenticity of their reported experiences, while developing explanations that rendered such phenomena medically rather than spiritually significant. The subjects exhibit remarkable unanimity in describing encounters with luminous beings of extraordinary beauty and wisdom. Mesmer wrote in his confidential reports, "Their physiological responses during claimed visitations are consistent and measurable. Elevated pulse, dilated pupils, altered breathing patterns, and brain activity suggesting profound alterations in consciousness. However, these symptoms correspond precisely to known effects of various nervous conditions that can be induced through specific environmental and psychological manipulations." This approach proved remarkably effective. By acknowledging the reality of mystical experiences while providing scientific explanations for their occurrence, Vatican researchers could dismiss claims of direct divine contact without appearing to deny legitimate spiritual phenomena. Individuals who reported Seraphim encounters weren't accused of lying or spiritual pride. They were diagnosed with medical conditions requiring appropriate treatment rather than theological investigation. Dr. Philippe Pinel, who pioneered humane treatment of mental illness, also contributed to the Vatican's research program. Through his analysis of what church authorities termed religious melancholia, his classification system, developed specifically for ecclesiastical use, provided detailed criteria for distinguishing authentic spiritual experiences that supported church authority from pathological conditions that mimicked divine revelation. According to Pinel's diagnostic framework, healthy religious experience increased individuals' dependence on institutional guidance, encouraged greater participation in approved spiritual practices, and produced psychological effects that enhanced rather than challenged ecclesiastical authority. Pathological religious experience, by contrast, granted individuals spiritual confidence independent of clerical approval, encouraged practices outside institutional control, and produced psychological changes that reduced rather than increased respect for religious hierarchy. This distinction allowed church authorities to acknowledge mystical phenomena while asserting medical authority over their interpretation. Individuals whose spiritual experiences led them toward greater ecclesiastical obedience were celebrated as examples of authentic divine favor. Those whose experiences encouraged spiritual autonomy were diagnosed with religious pathology, requiring medical intervention to restore proper spiritual dependence. The research program's most sophisticated work involved documenting the methods by which mystical experiences could be artificially induced, thereby proving their natural rather than supernatural origin. Dr. Luigi Galvani, famous for his experiments with electrical stimulation, conducted classified research demonstrating that specific electrical currents applied to particular brain regions could produce experiences virtually identical to reported Seraphim encounters. Galvani's subjects, drawn from convicted criminals, offered reduced sentences in exchange for participation, reported detailed visions of six-winged beings of light during electrical stimulation sessions. These artificially induced experiences matched historical accounts of seraphic visitations with remarkable precision. Subjects described identical imagery, received similar spiritual insights, and underwent comparable psychological transformations. The implications are profound, Galvani wrote in his secret reports. If we can reproduce the essential elements of claimed divine revelation through controlled application of natural forces, then such experiences require no supernatural explanation. The burning angels reported by mystics throughout history may be nothing more than particular patterns of brain activity that can be triggered by various natural causes. But the research program faced an unexpected challenge. Many investigators began experiencing their own encounters with beings of light during their studies of mystical phenomena. Dr. Alessandro Volta, while developing apparatus for measuring the electrical activity of subjects claiming angelic visitations, reported his own vision of six-winged entities who provided him with insights into the electrical nature of consciousness itself. Similarly, Dr. Antonio Scarpa, whose anatomical studies of mystics aimed to identify physical correlates of claimed divine encounters, experienced what he described as direct instruction from luminous beings about the relationship between brain function and spiritual awareness. His personal transformation from skeptical investigator to convinced experiencer forced the research program to develop protocols for managing mystical phenomena among their own staff. The solution reflected the program's fundamental goal of maintaining institutional control over spiritual experience. Researchers who reported their own encounters with beings of light were not dismissed or discredited, but were instead provided with ecclesiastical guidance to ensure proper interpretation of their experiences. Their mystical insights were acknowledged as potentially authentic, while being carefully channeled into forms that supported rather than challenged church authority. Dr. Lorenzo Spallanzani, whose biological research contributed to understanding of mystical physiology, experienced what he described as direct communion with divine intelligence during his investigations. Rather than questioning his scientific credentials, church supervisors assigned him spiritual directors who helped him understand that his experience represented divine confirmation of his research rather than challenge to ecclesiastical authority. This approach proved remarkably effective at containing the revolutionary implications of scientific research into mystical phenomena. Investigators who might have concluded that direct divine contact was universally accessible human capacity instead learned to interpret their own experiences as special divine favor, confirming their service to church interests. The research program's most lasting contribution was developing the theoretical framework for what would later be called the psychology of religion. By systematically studying mystical experiences while maintaining assumptions about their natural rather than supernatural origin, Vatican researchers pioneered scientific approaches to spiritual phenomena that would influence academic study for centuries. Their work established the principle that religious experiences, no matter how profound or transformative, could be understood through natural rather than supernatural causation. This framework allowed intellectual engagement with mystical phenomena while preserving institutional authority over their ultimate meaning and significance. Dr. Franz Joseph Gall, whose phrenological research claimed to identify brain regions associated with various mental faculties, conducted classified studies attempting to locate the specific areas responsible for mystical experience. His detailed brain measurements of individuals claiming Seraphim encounters led him to propose that such experiences resulted from overdevelopment of particular cranial regions rather than authentic divine contact. The subjects exhibit consistent patterns of cranial development, Gall reported, suggesting that claims of angelic visitation result from natural variations in brain structure rather than supernatural intervention. These individuals are not deceptive or spiritually gifted, but represent interesting examples of how neurological differences can produce experiences that mimic divine revelation. By the end of the 18th century, the Vatican's scientific research program had successfully established frameworks for explaining mystical phenomena that preserved institutional religious authority while appearing to embrace rational inquiry. Claims of direct divine contact could be acknowledged as authentic psychological experiences while being attributed to natural causes that required medical rather than theological interpretation. This approach proved remarkably durable. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, scientific study of religious experience continued to follow patterns established by the Vatican's secret research program. Mystical phenomena were investigated empirically, while maintaining assumptions about their natural causation that preserved institutional authority over spiritual development. Modern neuroscience, psychology, and cognitive science have inherited this framework largely intact. Contemporary research into mystical experience employs sophisticated technologies to document the reality of transcendent consciousness, while consistently attributing such phenomena to brain activity rather than divine contact. The burning ones may indeed touch human awareness, but such contact is automatically interpreted as neurological rather than spiritual phenomenon. The scientific suppression of mystical experience has proven far more effective than earlier theological strategies. Rather than simply denying the reality of direct divine contact, scientific approaches acknowledge such experiences while providing explanations that render them medically rather than spiritually significant. This allows intellectual engagement with mystical phenomena while preserving institutional gatekeeping over their ultimate meaning. Yet the same scientific methods that have been used to explain away direct divine contact have also documented its reality with unprecedented precision. Modern research confirms that mystical experiences are indeed transformative, consistent across cultures and centuries, and produce measurable changes in consciousness that cannot be easily dismissed as delusion or pathology. The irony is profound. Scientific investigation, designed to prove that Seraphim encounters were impossible, has instead provided the most detailed documentation of their effects on human consciousness ever recorded. The burning ones may be hidden behind theories about brain chemistry and neural activity, but their transformative influence on human awareness remains as evident to scientific observation as it was to medieval mystics. And perhaps that recognition that direct divine contact produces effects too consistent and profound to be explained away entirely, points toward possibilities that neither theological nor scientific suppression can indefinitely contain. The notification arrived via encrypted email at 3:47 a.m. Rome time. A single line of text in Latin: Ignis Seraphicus confirmatus, Protocolo silentium activatum. Seraphic fire confirmed. Silence protocol activated. Within 6 hours, a team of specialists had boarded a private jet from Rome's Ciampino airport. In their destination, a small town in rural Montana, where a Catholic parish priest had reported something that officially could never happen. Father Michael O'Brien had served St. Catherine's Church in Whitefish for 12 years without incident. His parishioners knew him as a practical man, more concerned with heating bills and youth programs than mystical theology, which made his 2:30 a.m. call to the diocesan office all the more alarming. He claimed that during late-night prayer in his church, 6 winged beings of pure light had appeared, granting him direct knowledge of divine truth that contradicted fundamental Catholic teaching about the necessity of religious mediation. The call triggered protocols that had been refined over centuries, but adapted for the digital age. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith maintains what insiders call the database, a classified system tracking reports of claimed Seraphim encounters worldwide. Unlike the Vatican's publicized investigations of claimed miracles or demonic possessions, these cases are handled with absolute secrecy through procedures that have no official documentation. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the clinical psychologist who led the Montana response team, had spent 15 years conducting what her university colleagues believed was research into religious psychology. In reality, she was one of 43 specialists worldwide, employed by the Vatican to investigate and contain reports of direct angelic contact. Her background in cognitive behavioral therapy, combined with classified training in what the Church calls spiritual intervention techniques, made her uniquely qualified for missions that officially didn't exist. The modern containment protocol reflects lessons learned from 8 centuries of managing mystical claims. Rather than the crude suppression methods of earlier eras, contemporary approaches employ sophisticated psychological techniques designed to redirect authentic spiritual experiences toward support for institutional authority, while eliminating those that challenge ecclesiastical control. Phase 1 involves immediate isolation and assessment. Individuals who report Seraphim encounters are removed from their normal environment under medical pretexts, typically claims of stress-related breakdown or neurological concerns that require specialized evaluation. This separation prevents them from sharing their experiences with others, while providing controlled conditions for detailed investigation. Father O'Brien was convinced to accept temporary medical leave after diocesan authorities expressed concern about his mental health. Following what they termed his spiritual crisis, he was transported to a private facility outside Denver that officially treats clergy suffering from burnout, but actually serves as a containment center for priests whose mystical experiences threaten institutional authority. Phase 2 employs sophisticated psychological evaluation to distinguish authentic mystical experiences from fabrication, delusion, or psychological projection. Vatican specialists use advanced neuroimaging, psychological testing, and interview techniques developed specifically for assessing claims of divine revelation. Their goal isn't to determine the ultimate truth of such reports, but to identify which pose genuine threats to religious authority. Dr. Martinez's evaluation of Father O'Brien lasted 3 weeks. Brain scans revealed patterns consistent with profound mystical experience, altered activity in regions associated with self-awareness, temporal perception, and religious cognition. Psychological testing showed no evidence of psychosis, delusional thinking, or personality disorders that might explain his reported encounters. Most significantly, his detailed descriptions of Seraphim visitations matched historical accounts with remarkable precision. The assessment concluded that Father O'Brien had indeed experienced authentic contact with beings that fit classical descriptions of Seraphim. But the evaluation also determined that his interpretation of these encounters posed severe threats to Catholic authority. He claimed the beings had told him that every human soul could achieve direct divine communion without sacramental mediation, that religious institutions often obstructed rather than facilitated spiritual development, and that individual mystical experience provided more reliable guidance than ecclesiastical teaching. Phase 3 implements targeted intervention, designed to either redirect mystical experiences toward support for institutional authority or eliminate them entirely. The specific approach depends on the individual's psychological profile, social influence, and potential for containing their experiences within approved theological frameworks. Father O'Brien underwent what the protocol terms cognitive reorientation therapy, a combination of psychological techniques and pharmaceutical interventions designed to alter the neural pathways associated with mystical technique. Experience. The treatment employed sophisticated methods developed from decades of classified research into the neurological basis of religious consciousness. Dr. James Crawford, the neurologist who supervised Father O'Brien's treatment, had published extensively on the brain chemistry of spiritual experience while secretly working for Vatican programs aimed at controlling mystical phenomena. His techniques combined selective use of psychiatric medications, targeted psychological conditioning, and what he termed spiritual reconditioning to reshape how individuals interpreted their encounters with divine consciousness. The goal, Crawford explained in classified training materials, isn't to convince subjects that their experiences were false, but to help them understand that authentic divine contact requires proper theological interpretation to avoid dangerous spiritual presumption. We acknowledge the reality of their encounters while redirecting their meaning toward support for ecclesiastical authority. The treatment proved partially successful. After 6 weeks of intervention, Father O'Brien accepted that his Seraphim encounters, while possibly authentic, had been misinterpreted due to his lack of advanced theological training. He agreed that individual mystical experience required careful ecclesiastical guidance to avoid spiritual errors that could endanger both his own soul and those under his pastoral care. However, The intervention also eliminated his capacity for further mystical experience. Neurological testing revealed that the treatment had effectively severed the neural pathways that enabled transcendent consciousness. Father O'Brien retained intellectual memory of his encounters, but lost all ability to enter the mystical states that had made such contact possible. He returned to his parish 6 months later, officially recovered from stress-related exhaustion. His homilies emphasized the importance of traditional religious observance and the dangers of seeking spiritual experiences outside approved church channels. Parishioners noticed that his previous warmth and spiritual insight had been replaced by mechanical adherence to conventional Catholic teaching. But they attributed this change to his recent health struggles. The Montana case illustrates how modern containment protocols have evolved to address contemporary challenges while maintaining the same fundamental goal: preventing direct divine contact from undermining institutional religious authority. Unlike earlier suppression methods that relied on persecution or physical elimination, current approaches employ sophisticated medical and psychological interventions that preserve individuals while eliminating their capacity for dangerous spiritual experiences. The database maintained by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith tracks approximately 200 to 300 reported Seraphim encounters annually worldwide. Most cases are resolved through Phase 1 isolation and psychological counseling that convinces individuals their experiences were stress-related hallucinations or psychological projections. More persistent cases require the intensive interventions employed in Phase 3. Sister Catherine Mendez, a Carmelite nun in Barcelona, reported regular communication with 6-winged beings who provided her with direct instruction about achieving divine union. Her superior, concerned about the nun's growing influence within the community, reported the case to Vatican authorities. Sister Catherine underwent 6 months of spiritual direction at a specialized facility where her capacity for mystical experience was systematically eliminated through psychological conditioning, combined with medications that disrupted the brain chemistry associated with transcendent consciousness. Dr. Ahmed Hassan, a Muslim convert to Catholicism teaching at Georgetown University, claimed that Seraphim had appeared to him during academic research into comparative mysticism. His published papers began suggesting that direct divine contact was accessible through techniques found in multiple religious traditions, undermining Catholic claims about the unique necessity of sacramental mediation. Dr. Hassan experienced a sudden onset of what appeared to be early dementia, requiring his retirement from academic life and entry into a care facility that specialized in treating clergy and religious scholars. The protocol's most challenging cases involve individuals whose mystical experiences have been witnessed by others or documented through physical evidence. Father Antonio Silva in Brazil claimed that Seraphim visitations were accompanied by phenomena that could be photographed and recorded. When his claims began attracting international attention, he suffered what official records describe as a mental breakdown, during which he destroyed all evidence of his encounters and publicly recanted his previous statements. These cases reveal the sophistication of modern containment methods. Rather than simply denying the reality of Seraphim encounters, contemporary protocols acknowledge such experiences while ensuring they are interpreted and managed in ways that support rather than challenge institutional authority. The burning ones may indeed continue to seek contact with human consciousness, but such contact is systematically redirected to serve ecclesiastical rather than individual spiritual development. The database also tracks broader patterns that concern Vatican authorities. Reports of Seraphim encounters have increased significantly since 2000, particularly among younger Catholics who combine traditional religious practice with meditation techniques drawn from other spiritual traditions. Social media and internet communication make it increasingly difficult to contain mystical claims before they spread to broader populations. Digital monitoring systems flag online discussions that reference 6-winged beings, direct divine communication, or spiritual practices that might facilitate contact with seraphim. Individuals who post detailed accounts of angelic encounters often receive private messages from helpful Catholics who offer spiritual guidance designed to redirect their experiences toward approved interpretations. The protocol has adapted to address what church authorities recognize as the growing challenge of managing mystical experiences in an interconnected world. Traditional methods of isolation and individual intervention become less effective when spiritual seekers can instantly connect with global communities of like-minded individuals. Contemporary containment strategies increasingly focus on shaping public discourse about mystical experience rather than simply suppressing individual cases. Vatican-sponsored research into the psychology and neuroscience of religious experience provides scientific frameworks for interpreting divine encounters that preserve institutional authority while appearing to embrace rational inquiry. The modern protocol represents the culmination of centuries of institutional learning about managing threats to religious authority posed by direct divine contact. Through sophisticated psychological, medical, and technological interventions, the Church has developed methods for acknowledging mystical experiences while ensuring they support, rather than challenge, ecclesiastical control. Yet the increasing frequency of reported seraphim encounters suggests that institutional containment strategies may be reaching their limits. The burning ones appear to be seeking contact with human consciousness with unprecedented urgency, perhaps recognizing that traditional methods of suppression are becoming less effective in an interconnected world, where spiritual experiences can be instantly shared across global networks. The database continues to grow, documenting encounters that challenge fundamental assumptions about the relationship between individual spiritual experience and institutional religious authority. And somewhere in the depths of Vatican City, specialists trained in methods that officially don't exist prepare for the next report of contact with beings whose very existence threatens the foundations of organized religion. They were never supposed to survive. Throughout centuries of systematic suppression, institutional authorities had developed increasingly sophisticated methods for silencing those who claim direct contact with seraphim. Yet some witnesses not only experienced encounters with six-winged beings of light, but lived to document their experiences in detail, creating a hidden record of continued divine contact that challenges official denials of such phenomena. Mother Teresa of Calcutta died in 1997, canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church. But her private correspondence, released decades after her death, revealed spiritual experiences that her ecclesiastical supervisors had systematically suppressed during her lifetime. Among her letters were detailed accounts of encounters with beings she described as flames of living love, who appeared during her deepest periods of prayer and granted her direct knowledge of divine will. They came when human guidance failed. She wrote to her confessor in a letter dated 1976, "Six wings of pure light, faces too radiant for earthly sight, voices that spoke without sound directly into my soul. They showed me that love requires no institution, that service to the suffering connects us immediately to divine consciousness, that the poorest of the poor carry the same divine spark that burns in their celestial forms." Her confessor's response, also preserved in the archives, reveals the Church's standard approach to such claims: acknowledge the spiritual authenticity of her experience, while redirecting its interpretation towards support for institutional authority. He counseled her that her visions represented divine confirmation of her service to the Church, rather than independent spiritual revelation. But Mother Teresa's subsequent letters reveal growing tension between her direct spiritual experiences and official theological interpretation. The beings she encountered continued to appear, providing guidance that increasingly emphasized individual spiritual autonomy rather than ecclesiastical obedience. Her famous Dark Night of the Soul, publicly attributed to spiritual dryness, may have actually resulted from institutional pressure to suppress her most profound mystical experiences. Father Thomas Merton, the renowned contemplative monk, left encrypted passages in his personal journals that described regular communion with what he called the burning ones. These entries, decoded only after his death, revealed a sophisticated understanding of direct divine contact that he was forced to conceal during his lifetime. The monastery teaches that we approach God through prayer and sacrament, Merton wrote in cipher in 1965. But the six-winged ones show me that divine consciousness dwells already complete within human awareness, waiting only for recognition. They grant immediate knowing that renders years of theological study pale shadows of authentic spiritual understanding. Merton's public writings carefully avoided references to direct angelic contact, instead emphasizing contemplative practices that appeared safely within approved mystical traditions. But his private journals reveal that his influential spiritual insights originated from encounters with Seraphim, who provided direct instruction about the nature of consciousness and divine union. Sister Lucy dos Santos of Fatima, famous for her reported visions of the Virgin Mary, also claimed encounters with six-winged beings that church authorities systematically excluded from official accounts. Her unpublished memoirs, discovered in 2008, described how Seraphim appeared both before and after her celebrated Marian visions, providing context that church investigators deemed inappropriate for public devotion. According to Sister Lucy's complete account, the Seraphim explained that divine consciousness communicated through multiple channels, including appearances by Mary, Jesus, and various saints, but that all such manifestations represented attempts by transcendent awareness to awaken human souls to their inherent divine nature. This understanding contradicted Catholic teaching about the unique mediating role of specific religious figures. Church authorities editing her testimony carefully removed references to direct angelic instruction while preserving elements that supported approved Marian devotion. The resulting official narrative presented her experiences as validation of Catholic teaching, rather than revelation of universal spiritual principles that transcended denominational boundaries. Dr. Carl Jung, the renowned psychologist, documented his own encounters with six-winged beings in personal journals that were sealed for 50 years after his death. His scientific training led him to analyze these experiences with unusual precision, providing detailed observations that bridge mystical testimony and empirical research. They appear not as external entities, but as manifestations of consciousness itself, Jung wrote in entries discovered in 1961. Six wings of living light that emerge from depths of awareness usually inaccessible to ordinary mental activity. They grant immediate understanding of psychological and spiritual principles that no amount of academic study could provide. Jung's public work on the psychology of religion carefully avoided direct references to his own mystical experiences, while incorporating insights gained from Seraphim encounters. His theories about the collective unconscious, archetypal images, and individuation process reflected knowledge transmitted through direct angelic contact that he presented in acceptable psychological terminology. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, the Jesuit priest and paleontologist, embedded coded references to Seraphim encounters throughout his theological writings. His concept of the noosphere, a sphere of human consciousness evolving toward divine union, originated from visions granted by six-winged beings, who showed him the evolutionary trajectory of consciousness itself. Teilhard's correspondence with fellow scientists contained veiled references to luminous intelligences, who provided him with insights that bridged scientific and mystical understanding. His famous vision of cosmic consciousness emerging through evolution reflected direct instruction from beings who existed beyond temporal limitations. Church authorities suppressed Teilhard's most explicit spiritual writings during his lifetime, recognizing that his evolutionary mysticism challenged traditional concepts of divine transcendence. But his published works successfully transmitted core insights about consciousness evolution that originated from direct Seraphim contact. Contemporary witnesses continue to report encounters despite sophisticated institutional suppression methods. Father Richard Rohr, the Franciscan spiritual teacher, has carefully documented experiences with beings of light that provided him with insights about universal spiritual principles found across religious traditions. They show me that divine love recognizes no denominational boundaries, Rohr wrote in private journals that were briefly leaked online before being removed. The same consciousness that Christians call Christ, Muslims call Allah, and Buddhists call Buddha, nature appears through six-winged messengers, who teach that all authentic spiritual paths lead toward the same divine union. Rohr's public teachings carefully present these insights within acceptable Christian frameworks, while preserving their essential, universal message. His influence on contemporary spirituality demonstrates how Seraphim-derived wisdom can be transmitted despite institutional efforts at containment. Dr. Eben Alexander, the neurosurgeon whose near-death experience challenged materialist assumptions about consciousness, reported encounters with angelic beings during his coma that matched classical descriptions of Seraphim. His detailed account, backed by medical documentation, provides contemporary scientific witness to the reality of such encounters. I was accompanied by beings of indescribable beauty and love, Alexander wrote. They had 6 wings of living light and faces that conveyed infinite compassion and wisdom. They communicated not through words, but through direct transmission of understanding that dissolved all questions about the nature of consciousness and divine reality. Alexander's medical training and institutional credibility made his testimony particularly challenging for authorities seeking to contain mystical claims. His account reached global audiences through mainstream media channels that normally avoided coverage of supernatural phenomena. The consistency of witness accounts across centuries, cultures, and religious backgrounds reveals patterns that suggest authentic contact with transcendent intelligence, rather than psychological projection or cultural conditioning. Despite vast differences in education, nationality, and historical context, individuals who report Seraphim encounters describe remarkably similar experiences. 6-winged beings of pure light, whose presence transforms consciousness immediately and permanently. Communication through direct transmission of understanding rather than verbal exchange. Knowledge granted that transcends normal human learning and provides insight into the fundamental nature of reality. Transformation that emphasizes universal spiritual principles rather than specific religious doctrines. Modern neuroscience has documented measurable brain changes in individuals who report such encounters. Dr. Andrew Newberg's research at the University of Pennsylvania revealed distinct neural patterns in subjects claiming ongoing contact with angelic beings. Brain scans showed enhanced connectivity between regions associated with transcendent awareness, increased activity in areas linked to emotional well-being, and permanent changes in neural structures associated with spiritual understanding. These findings suggest that reported Seraphim encounters produce verifiable alterations in brain function that persist long after the initial experience. The consistency of these neurological changes across different subjects provides empirical support for the authenticity of claimed divine contact. The witnesses who spoke despite institutional suppression have preserved crucial knowledge about humanity's relationship with transcendent consciousness. Their testimonies, hidden in private journals, encoded in public writings, and transmitted through careful spiritual direction, maintain connection to possibilities that official religious authorities have spent centuries denying. Their accounts reveal that direct divine contact continues, regardless of institutional approval or suppression. The Seraphim appear to recognize no human authority over their ancient work of awakening divine consciousness within human hearts. They offer the same transformative contact to contemporary seekers, that they provided to biblical prophets and medieval mystics. The burning ones burn still, their fire undimmed by centuries of denial, their message unchanged, despite sophisticated suppression efforts. And in the testimonies of those brave enough to speak despite the risks, their light continues to illuminate possibilities that no amount of institutional darkness can permanently obscure. The document that terrified every major religious leader in the 20th century was only 12 pages long. Compiled in 1962 by a secret ecumenical committee during the Second Vatican Council, it analyzed the implications of widespread seraphim encounters with clinical precision. The report's conclusion was stark. Authentic contact with God's highest angels didn't just threaten Catholic authority, it challenged the fundamental premise upon which all organized religion was built. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI, wrote the margin notes that survived on the only remaining copy. If the seraphim grant direct access to divine consciousness, then every cathedral becomes superfluous, every priest redundant, every doctrine provisional. We face not reform, but obsolescence. The theological time bomb had been ticking for centuries, but the modern world's capacity for instant global communication transformed a theoretical threat into an existential crisis. Unlike medieval mystics who could be isolated and silenced, contemporary individuals claiming seraphim encounters could instantly share their experiences with millions of people worldwide. Each authentic account threatened to awaken recognition that institutional religion might be an obstacle rather than a pathway to divine connection. The committee's analysis revealed why seraphim posed unique dangers that even the most sophisticated theological frameworks couldn't contain. Unlike other spiritual phenomena that could be integrated into existing religious structures, direct angelic contact offered something that made institutions fundamentally unnecessary: immediate access to the divine source that all religions claim to represent. Rabbi David Hartman, one of the Jewish representatives on the secret committee, captured the universal threat in his classified assessment. When Moses encountered the burning bush, we built a priesthood to interpret his experience. When the seraphim appeared to Isaiah, we developed elaborate ritual to approach divine holiness. But if these beings offer direct communion to ordinary seekers, then all our mediating structures become not just unnecessary, but actively harmful walls, blocking access to what they claim to provide. The psychological implications were equally devastating. Religious institutions had shaped human consciousness for millennia through carefully constructed narratives about divine transcendence and human unworthiness. Believers were taught that they needed intermediaries to approach God, that direct divine contact was either impossible or dangerous, that spiritual authority resided in trained clergy rather than individual experience. But seraphim encounters systematically dismantled these foundational assumptions. Individuals who experienced direct angelic contact reported immediate recognition of their own divine nature, instant access to spiritual wisdom that surpassed years of religious education, and profound understanding that made external religious authority seem not just unnecessary, but ridiculous. Dr. Reinhold Niebuhr, the Protestant theologian who participated in the committee's work, wrote privately about the challenge this posed to all Christian denominations. We have built our entire theological structure on the premise that humans are fallen beings requiring divine grace mediated through proper channels. But if the seraphim are correct, if every soul already contains divine consciousness, waiting for recognition, then our fundamental anthropology is not just wrong, but deliberately deceptive. The committee's research revealed that seraphim encounters produced remarkably consistent effects regardless of the recipient's religious background. Catholic mystics, Protestant evangelicals, Orthodox monks, and even secular individuals reported identical transformations: immediate recognition of divine consciousness as their true nature, direct access to spiritual knowledge that transcended all human teaching, and profound peace that eliminated the anxiety and guilt upon which religious institutions depended. This consistency suggested that authentic spiritual contact operated according to universal principles, rather than denominational doctrines. The Burning Ones appeared to recognize no religious boundaries, offering the same transformative experience to anyone prepared to receive it, regardless of their theological beliefs or institutional affiliations. The implications extended beyond Christianity. Islamic representatives on the committee reported similar patterns in Sufi communities, where individuals claimed direct encounter with beings matching Seraphim descriptions. Buddhist monasteries documented cases of practitioners whose meditation led to visions of six-winged entities that granted immediate enlightenment. Even secular spiritual seekers reported encounters with beings of light that transformed their understanding of consciousness and reality. This cross-cultural consistency suggested that Seraphim contact represented something far more fundamental than religious phenomenon. It appeared to be a universal human capacity for direct divine communion that institutional religion had systematically suppressed across all traditions. Professor Houston Smith, the religious studies scholar who secretly advised the committee, analyzed the threat this posed to academic theology. If authentic spirituality operates independently of religious institutions, then our entire field of study becomes archaeology rather than theology. We would be documenting historical artifacts of spiritual development rather than engaging with living divine reality. The committee identified specific mechanisms by which widespread Seraphim encounters would undermine institutional authority. Unlike gradual spiritual development that could be managed through religious guidance, angelic contact produced immediate and complete transformation that rendered external authority irrelevant. Recipients didn't need years of theological education to understand divine truth. They received direct transmission of complete spiritual knowledge in moments of contact. More dangerously, individuals who experienced Seraphim encounters often became capable of facilitating similar experiences in others. Rather than requiring special ordination or institutional approval, they could share transformative spiritual practices that enabled direct divine contact. This created the possibility of rapid exponential growth in numbers of people who no longer needed religious institutions. The committee's economic analysis revealed financial implications that terrified religious administrators. Catholic contributions alone represented billions of dollars annually, all dependent on maintaining believer confidence in the necessity of institutional mediation for spiritual development. If significant numbers of Catholics achieved direct divine contact, donations would plummet as people redirected resources from supporting institutions toward individual spiritual practice. Protestant denominations faced similar challenges. Tithing, missionary support, and construction of religious facilities all depended on maintaining the fiction that spiritual development required institutional participation. Direct angelic contact eliminated this dependency, threatening the economic foundations of organized religion across all denominations. Dr. Paul Tillich, whose theological writings had influenced Protestant thought for decades, acknowledged the deeper challenge in his classified contribution to the committee. We have confused the symbol with the reality, the institution with the divine presence it supposedly represents. If the Seraphim offered direct access to that presence, they reveal that we have been selling maps to treasure that lies freely available in every human heart. The committee's analysis of historical precedents revealed how effectively institutions had previously contained similar threats. Medieval mystical movements, Protestant Reformation attempts at direct biblical interpretation, and various revival movements had all been successfully redirected or suppressed through careful theological management. But contemporary global communication made traditional containment strategies increasingly ineffective. Social media platforms allowed instant sharing of spiritual experiences across traditional, geographic, and denominational boundaries. Video testimonies, meditation instructions, and detailed accounts of angelic encounters could reach millions of viewers before institutional authorities could respond. Traditional methods of isolation and individual suppression proved inadequate against viral distribution of transformative spiritual content. The psychological sophistication of modern populations also complicated containment efforts. Unlike medieval believers who accepted clerical interpretation of spiritual experiences without question, contemporary individuals possessed analytical tools and scientific understanding that made them more resistant to institutional manipulation of their personal experiences. The committee's final report outlined 3 possible scenarios for religious institutions facing widespread Seraphim encounters. Adaptation involved acknowledging direct, divine contact while maintaining institutional relevance through new interpretive frameworks. Suppression required developing more sophisticated methods for eliminating mystical claims before they could spread. Obsolescence represented the possibility that authentic spiritual contact would simply bypass institutional religion entirely, leaving organized religion as an increasingly irrelevant cultural artifact. Each scenario posed profound challenges. Adaptation risked legitimizing the very experiences that threatened institutional authority. Suppression required resources and coordination that might prove impossible in a globally connected world. Obsolescence represented the extinction of religious institutions that had shaped human civilization for millennia. Cardinal Montini, later Pope Paul VI, summarized the existential nature of the threat in his response to the committee's findings. We face not theological disagreement, but theological irrelevance. If the faithful can commune directly with divine consciousness, then our entire edifice of doctrine, ritual, and authority becomes not just unnecessary, but potentially obstructive to authentic spiritual development. The committee disbanded without reaching consensus on how religious institutions should respond to the Seraphim threat. Their report was classified at the highest levels and distributed only to a handful of senior religious leaders across major denominations. Public acknowledgement of their findings was deemed too dangerous. It might encourage the very phenomenon they feared. But the theological time bomb they identified continues ticking. Each authentic Seraphim encounter creates ripple effects that challenge institutional authority. Each individual who achieves direct divine contact becomes a potential catalyst for others. Each moment of genuine spiritual communion reveals the gap between institutional promises and accessible reality. The burning ones offer what every religion claims to provide: direct access to divine truth, immediate spiritual transformation, and permanent connection to transcendent consciousness. But they offer it without conditions, without intermediaries, without institutional control. They represent not the fulfillment of religious promise, but its complete transcendence. And perhaps that recognition that authentic spirituality might exist independently of the institutions that claim to represent it points toward possibilities that no amount of theological sophistication can indefinitely postpone. The YouTube video was uploaded at 2:17 a.m. on March 3, 2019, by a user identified only as Sarah M. Mystic. Filmed on a smartphone in what appeared to be a modest apartment bedroom, it showed a soft-spoken nurse from Denver describing her encounter with 6 winged beings of light during a near-death experience following a car accident. Within 48 hours, the video had been viewed 1.2 million times. Within a week, it had spawned hundreds of response videos from individuals around the world sharing remarkably similar experiences. For the first time in centuries, the institutional gatekeepers who had controlled mystical discourse found themselves powerless to contain the spread of Seraphim encounter accounts. The digital revolution had fundamentally altered the landscape of spiritual communication, creating channels that no religious authority could monitor, moderate, or suppress effectively. Dr. Michael Barkan, who studies conspiracy theories and fringe religious movements at Syracuse University, documented the emergence of what he termed the Seraphim phenomenon in digital spaces. His research, conducted over 5 years of monitoring online spiritual communities, revealed patterns that challenged conventional understanding of how mystical claims spread through populations. Traditional religious authority depended on controlling information flow, Barkun explained in his unpublished research notes. Mystical experiences were filtered through institutional interpretation before reaching broader audiences. But digital platforms allowed direct peer-to-peer sharing of spiritual accounts that bypass all traditional gatekeeping mechanisms. The r divided by Seraphim subreddit, created in 2016, grew from 12 members to over 89,000 subscribers by 2023. Unlike traditional religious forums moderated by clergy or approved spiritual directors, this community operated according to experiential rather than doctrinal criteria. Members shared detailed accounts of encounters with six-winged beings, compared meditation techniques that facilitated such contact, and provided mutual support for integrating transformative spiritual experiences. The consistency of reported experiences across cultural, religious, and geographic boundaries proved particularly striking. A Catholic grandmother in rural Ireland described encounters virtually identical to those reported by a Buddhist practitioner in urban Japan. A secular scientist in Germany shared experiences that matched accounts from a Pentecostal minister in rural Alabama. The six-winged beings appeared consistently across all demographics, offering similar messages about direct divine accessibility and individual spiritual autonomy. Emma Chen, a data analyst who studied the phenomenon as part of her computer science dissertation at MIT, developed algorithms to analyze linguistic patterns in thousands of Seraphim encounter accounts posted across multiple platforms. Her findings revealed statistical consistency that suggested either coordinated fabrication or genuine contact with shared spiritual realities. The vocabulary used to describe these beings shows remarkable uniformity across different languages and cultural backgrounds, Chen wrote in her restricted access thesis. Individuals with no apparent connection consistently use identical metaphors, describe similar physiological effects, and report comparable insights. The probability of such consistency, arising from cultural conditioning or psychological suggestion, approaches statistical impossibility. Social media algorithms, designed to maximize engagement by showing users content similar to their interests, began creating what researchers called spiritual feedback loops. Individuals who watched one Seraphim encounter video were automatically shown similar content, exposing them to dozens of accounts that reinforced the possibility of direct angelic contact. This artificial amplification accelerated the spread of mystical claims beyond anything possible in pre-digital eras. The Vatican's initial response relied on traditional suppression strategies adapted for digital platforms. Cardinal Luis Ladaria, prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, authorized what insiders called Operation Digital Shepherd, a coordinated effort to counter Seraphim accounts through carefully placed content that provided alternative explanations for reported experiences. The operation employed sophisticated techniques, including search engine optimization, to ensure that queries about angelic encounters returned, results emphasizing psychological rather than spiritual interpretations. Paid social media advertising promoted content questioning the reliability of mystical experiences. Anonymous accounts on spiritual forums consistently redirected conversations toward approved theological frameworks. But digital suppression proved far more challenging than traditional containment methods. Unlike medieval mystics who could be isolated individually, online communities provided instant support networks that validated and normalized transformative spiritual experiences. Attempts to discredit specific accounts often backfired by drawing additional attention to the phenomenon. The emergence of encrypted communication platforms created spaces that institutional authorities couldn't monitor effectively. Telegram channels, Discord servers, and specialized forums allowed individuals claiming Seraphim encounters to share detailed guidance about achieving direct divine contact without fear of institutional intervention. One encrypted channel, discovered by researchers only after a member shared access credentials publicly, contained over 3,000 participants worldwide, sharing practical techniques for facilitating angelic encounters. The content included specific meditation practices, breathing exercises, and consciousness preparation methods that members claimed reliably produced contact with six-winged beings. The practical nature of this shared knowledge represented a fundamental shift from historical patterns. Rather than simply describing mystical experiences after they occurred, digital communities began developing systematic approaches for inducing such encounters. Members reported increasingly frequent Seraphim contact as they refined and shared effective techniques. Dr. Jeffrey Kripal, who studies mystical experiences at Rice University, identified this development as potentially revolutionary. For the first time in history, we're seeing the emergence of reproducible methods for achieving direct, divine contact that operate independently of institutional religious frameworks. These aren't random mystical experiences, but deliberately cultivated spiritual technologies. The global reach of digital platforms exposed striking parallels between contemporary Seraphim accounts and historical mystical traditions that had been systematically suppressed. Online researchers began uncovering and sharing translated fragments from banned medieval texts, censored mystical treatises, and suppressed spiritual manuals that described identical encounters with six-winged beings. These historical parallels provided contextual framework that helped contemporary experiencers understand their encounters as part of ongoing spiritual tradition, rather than isolated, anomalous events. The discovery that Seraphim contact had been documented and suppressed for centuries gave digital communities confidence that their experiences represented authentic spiritual phenomena rather than psychological aberrations. Blockchain technology enabled the creation of permanent, uncensorable archives of Seraphim encounter accounts. The Eternal Testimony Project, launched in 2020, stores encrypted spiritual experiences on distributed ledgers that no central authority can alter or delete. Contributors worldwide upload detailed accounts of angelic encounters, creating an indestructible record that preserves mystical testimony regardless of institutional suppression efforts. Artificial intelligence analysis of these archived accounts revealed patterns that human researchers had missed. Machine learning algorithms identified consistent elements in encounter descriptions that suggested structured rather than random mystical experiences. The AI detected linguistic patterns indicating that reported Seraphim communications followed coherent philosophical frameworks focused on human spiritual evolution and institutional transcendence. Perhaps most significantly, digital platforms enabled real-time coordination between individuals experiencing simultaneous Seraphim encounters. Multiple participants reported receiving communications from six-winged beings during the same time periods, suggesting coordinated rather than individual divine contact. Live-streamed meditation sessions occasionally captured multiple participants reporting identical angelic visitations occurring simultaneously across different geographic locations. These synchronized experiences challenged traditional assumptions about the individual nature of mystical phenomena. Rather than isolated personal revelations, Seraphim encounters appeared to represent coordinated communications from transcendent intelligence, seeking contact with human consciousness on a global scale. The institutional response evolved as traditional suppression methods proved ineffective. Rather than attempting to prevent the spread of Seraphim accounts, religious authorities began developing strategies for co-opting and redirecting the phenomenon. Approved spiritual directors started offering guidance for interpreting angelic encounters within orthodox theological frameworks. Official church websites began acknowledging mystical experiences while emphasizing the need for institutional discernment. But these adaptive strategies faced the same fundamental challenge that had confronted religious authorities for centuries. Authentic Seraphim encounters systematically undermined the premise that institutional mediation was necessary for divine contact. Digital communities provided extensive documentation that direct angelic communication was accessible to anyone with proper preparation, regardless of religious affiliation or ecclesiastical approval. The proliferation of mobile recording technology meant that increasingly sophisticated documentation accompanied reported encounters. High-definition video, multi-spectrum photography, and sensitive audio equipment captured phenomena associated with claimed seraphim visitations that traditional skeptical explanations couldn't easily dismiss. Dr. Gary Schwartz's laboratory at the University of Arizona began receiving digital documentation of mystical experiences that included measurable electromagnetic anomalies, unexplained light phenomena, and acoustic signatures that correlated with reported angelic appearances. While maintaining scientific skepticism, Schwartz acknowledged that some documented cases presented challenges to conventional explanations. We're seeing reproducible anomalous phenomena associated with reported mystical experiences, Schwartz noted in his research summaries. While we can't confirm supernatural causation, the consistency of measurable effects suggests these experiences involve more than simple psychological projection or cultural conditioning. The democratization of advanced recording technology meant that institutional authorities could no longer control which mystical claims received serious documentation. Unlike historical periods when only church-approved experiences were carefully recorded, digital age mystics possessed tools for creating detailed evidence of their encounters that bypassed all institutional filtering. Perhaps most importantly, the global nature of digital communication revealed that seraphim encounters were occurring with increasing frequency across all populations. Rather than isolated incidents requiring individual suppression, institutional authorities faced what appeared to be a coordinated emergence of direct divine contact that transcended all traditional containment strategies. The Burning Ones, it seemed, had adapted their ancient work of awakening human consciousness to the possibilities of digital age communication. They offered the same transformative contact they had provided throughout history, but now that contact could be instantly shared, systematically documented, and collectively explored by global communities that no institutional authority could effectively control. The age of containing divine revelation within manageable theological boundaries was ending, and in its place, a new era of direct spiritual communication was emerging, one that operated according to transcendent rather than institutional authority, powered by technologies that made traditional gatekeeping obsolete. The data points were scattered across decades, hidden in psychiatric reports, near-death experience studies, and meditation research archives. But when Dr. Sarah Kellerman compiled them into a single database in 2023, the pattern became unmistakable. Reports of seraphim encounters were not randomly distributed through time, but clustered around periods of profound spiritual and social upheaval. The Burning Ones, it appeared, returned with increasing frequency whenever humanity faced its deepest crises of meaning and institutional authority. Dr. Kellerman's research, conducted at the Institute for Consciousness Studies in Petaluma, revealed correlations that traditional academic frameworks struggled to explain. Seraphim encounter reports spiked during the Black Death, when church authority proved inadequate to address existential suffering. They surged during the scientific revolution, as empirical methods challenged religious explanations of reality. They peaked during both world wars, when institutional promises of divine protection collapsed under industrial-scale violence, and they were increasing exponentially in the 21st century. The pattern suggests responsive rather than random contact, Kellerman wrote in her unpublished analysis. These beings appear most frequently when existing meaning, making systems fail, when institutional authorities lose credibility, when individuals must seek direct spiritual guidance, because traditional sources have proven inadequate or deceptive. The contemporary surge began subtly in the 1,960 seconds, coinciding with widespread questioning of traditional authority across all sectors of society. Reports increased through the 1,980 seconds as institutional religion faced scandals that undermined clerical moral authority. They accelerated through the 2000s as global communication exposed the gaps between religious promises and institutional behavior. And they exploded after 2020, when pandemic lockdowns gave millions of people extended time for introspection, while simultaneously revealing the inadequacy of existing systems to address collective suffering. Unlike historical periods when Seraphim encounters occurred primarily among religious specialists, contemporary reports emerged from all segments of society. Healthcare workers exhausted by pandemic service reported beings of light who provided them with direct access to healing wisdom. Scientists questioning materialist assumptions described encounters with six-winged entities who revealed the consciousness-based nature of reality. Parents struggling with unprecedented social changes claimed guidance from luminous beings who helped them navigate challenges no previous generation had faced. The democratization of mystical experience reflected broader patterns of institutional failure and individual spiritual seeking, as traditional religious authorities lost credibility through scandal and irrelevance. Increasing numbers of individuals sought direct spiritual guidance that bypassed institutional mediation entirely. Father Thomas Keating, the Trappist monk whose contemplative prayer teachings influenced millions, privately documented his own encounters with Seraphim during the final years of his life. His unpublished journals, discovered after his death in 2018, revealed that his most profound spiritual insights originated from direct communication with six-winged beings who appeared during deep contemplative states. They come not to establish new religion, but to awaken remembrance of what religion was meant to point toward, Keating wrote in entries dated 2017. They offer direct access to the divine consciousness that institutional faith can only approximate through symbol and ritual. They represent not the end of spiritual seeking but its fulfillment through immediate rather than mediated divine contact. Keating's account reflected broader patterns among contemporary spiritual teachers who were quietly acknowledging direct angelic encounters while carefully avoiding public statements that might challenge institutional authority. Ram Dass reported communications with beings of light during his final years. Thich Nhat Hanh's students described his references to luminous messengers who provided guidance for Buddhist practice. Sufi teachers spoke privately of encounters with entities matching Seraphim descriptions who offered direct transmission of divine knowledge. The convergence of reports across religious traditions suggested that contemporary Seraphim contact transcended denominational boundaries entirely. The Burning Ones appeared to recognize no human categories of spiritual authority, offering the same transformative encounter to seekers regardless of their religious background or lack thereof. Dr. Rick Strassman's research with DMT at the University of New Mexico documented encounters with entities that participants consistently described as six-winged beings of light who provided direct instruction about consciousness, reality. His clinical studies, conducted under rigorous scientific protocols, revealed that individuals could reliably access communication with what appeared to be the same transcendent intelligence across multiple sessions. The entities encountered in advanced mystical states show remarkable consistency across subjects. Strassman noted in his research summaries, they appear as autonomous intelligences rather than psychological projections, possess knowledge that subjects couldn't have accessed through normal means, and consistently communicate messages about human spiritual potential that challenge materialist assumptions about consciousness. Independent research by Dr. Robin Carhart Harris at Imperial College London, using psilocybin, produced similar findings. Brain imaging revealed that mystical experiences involved decreased activity in the default mode network, the brain regions associated with ego consciousness, while participants reported encounters with beings of light who provide direct access to transcendent knowledge. These scientific studies provided unprecedented documentation of the neurological correlates of Seraphim contact, while remaining agnostic about the ultimate source of such experiences. Whether interpreted as contact with external entities or activation of latent human spiritual capacities, the research confirmed that direct access to transcendent consciousness was reproducible under controlled conditions. The implications extended far beyond academic psychology. If reliable methods existed for achieving direct divine contact, then the fundamental premise of institutional religion, that such contact required clerical mediation, became demonstrably false. The Burning Ones offered immediate access to what religious institutions claimed only they could provide through years of preparation and proper theological guidance. Contemporary Seraphim encounters also differed qualitatively from historical accounts in their emphasis on collective rather than individual transformation. Medieval mystics typically received personal spiritual guidance or prophetic visions relevant to specific circumstances. But contemporary reports consistently described beings who communicated about humanity's evolutionary transition from institutional to direct spiritual relationship with divine consciousness. Maria Santos, a Portuguese nurse whose encounter during COVID-19 service went viral across social media platforms, reported communications that focused specifically on the obsolescence of intermediary spiritual authority. The six-winged beings who appeared to her, she claimed, emphasized that the current era represented a planned transition away from external religious guidance toward direct individual communion with divine consciousness. They showed me that institutional religion served a purpose when humanity was spiritually immature, Santos explained in online testimonies viewed by millions. Like training wheels on a bicycle, religious structures helped develop spiritual capacity until direct divine relationship became possible. But continuing to rely on such structures now prevents rather than facilitates authentic spiritual development. This message that religious institutions had become obstacles rather than pathways to spiritual growth appeared consistently across contemporary Seraphim accounts, regardless of the recipient's cultural background or previous religious affiliation. The beings seemed to be coordinating a global communication that challenged the fundamental legitimacy of organized religion itself. The institutional response revealed the existential threat such messages pose to religious authority. Rather than the sophisticated suppression methods employed historically, contemporary authorities increasingly adopted strategies of acknowledgement and co-optation. Vatican officials began speaking more openly about mystical experiences, while emphasizing the continued need for institutional discernment. Protestant leaders acknowledged direct divine communication, while maintaining that proper biblical interpretation required theological education. But these adaptive strategies faced the same fundamental challenge that had confronted religious authorities throughout history. Authentic Seraphim encounters consistently undermined, rather than supported, institutional claims about the necessity of clerical mediation. The Burning Ones offered immediate access to divine consciousness that made external religious authority appear not just unnecessary, but actively counterproductive. The acceleration of reported encounters suggested that whatever transition the Seraphim were facilitating was approaching a critical threshold. Social media algorithms amplified mystical content, meditation apps introduced millions to consciousness-altering practices, and global communication created communities of spiritual seekers who operated independently of traditional religious structures. Simultaneously, institutional religion faced unprecedented challenges to its credibility and relevance. Scandals, political compromises, and obvious gaps between spiritual promises and institutional behavior drove increasing numbers of sincere seekers away from organized religion toward direct spiritual exploration. The convergence of these trends, increasing accessibility of mystical experience and decreasing credibility of institutional authority, created conditions that historical religious authorities had spent centuries preventing. For the first time in human history, large populations possessed both the tools for achieving direct divine contact and the motivation to pursue it outside traditional religious frameworks. The implications for the future of human spiritual development were profound. If the Seraphim were indeed facilitating a transition from institutional to direct spiritual relationship with divine consciousness, humanity might be approaching a transformation as significant as the original emergence of organized religion itself. But this transition also posed unprecedented challenges. Religious institutions, whatever their limitations, had provided social cohesion, moral guidance, and meaning-making frameworks for millennia. Their obsolescence might create spiritual and social chaos that direct divine contact, however authentic, couldn't immediately replace. The Burning Ones seemed aware of these challenges. Contemporary accounts consistently described beings who emphasized gradual, rather than sudden spiritual transformation, who encouraged integration of direct divine contact with practical service to human welfare, and who stressed the importance of compassion and wisdom, rather than dramatic mystical experiences. Their message appeared to be that authentic spiritual evolution required not the destruction of human institutions, but their transformation through individuals who had achieved direct divine contact. Rather than abandoning society for mystical withdrawal, contemporary Seraphim encounters encouraged recipients to bring transcendent consciousness into ordinary life, creating new forms of spiritual community that honored direct divine relationship while serving collective human needs. Perhaps most significantly, the contemporary return of the Burning Ones suggested that the age of suppressed mystical experience was ending. Digital communication, scientific documentation, and global spiritual communities had created conditions where direct divine contact could no longer be effectively contained within institutional boundaries. The Seraphim appeared to be seizing this historical moment to restore humanity's original spiritual birthright, direct access to divine consciousness that required no external mediation, no institutional approval, no clerical interpretation. They offered the same transformative contact they had provided throughout history, but now, to populations equipped with tools and communities that could preserve and transmit such experiences, regardless of institutional opposition. The war between direct divine contact and religious authority that had raged for centuries might finally be ending, not through institutional victory, but through institutional irrelevance. The Burning Ones had simply waited for conditions where their ancient offer of immediate divine communion could be freely received, shared, and integrated into human consciousness without fear of suppression. The fire that no authority could permanently extinguish was beginning to burn openly in human hearts worldwide. And in that growing light, the shadow of institutional control over spiritual development was finally beginning to recede, revealing possibilities for human spiritual evolution that transcended all previous limitations. The age of the Burning Ones had returned. The question now was whether humanity was ready to receive the gift they had always offered: direct access to the divine consciousness that was, and always had been, the true source and destination of every authentic spiritual seeking.